Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. A girl's voice, barely audible on a scratchy recording. I'm scared. He said he'd find me. The line goes dead. Somewhere in a small town, a phone rings in an empty apartment. No one answers. In another city, a car sits abandoned in a parking lot. Keys still in the ignition, driver's door hanging open. Miles away, a mother checks her daughter's bedroom for the 15th time that night, hoping this time she'll be there. And in a courthouse, a judge reviews a case file, unaware that the defendant sitting calmly in the gallery has already decided that if he can't have her, no one will. 5 stories. 5 failures. One question that echoes through every investigation, every courtroom, every family's sleepless nights. How many signs were missed? Tonight, we're not just telling you about crimes. We're showing you the moments before, the warning signs that flickered like distant lightning, the systems that were supposed to protect but instead became obstacles, and the families who refused to let their loved ones become statistics. These stories span different states, different circumstances, different victims. But they share something troubling. In each case, someone saw it coming. Someone knew. Someone warned. And the machinery that was supposed to respond either moved too slowly, looked the other way, or simply wasn't designed to handle the kind of danger that doesn't announce itself with obvious violence. This isn't about assigning blame to individuals. It's about understanding how patterns repeat, how good people working within broken systems can still produce tragic outcomes, and how the distance between safety and catastrophe can be measured in minutes, in missed phone calls, in paperwork that sits on a desk just a little too long. You'll hear about a teenager who told everyone who would listen that she was in danger. You'll learn about a young mother whose night out ended with a car soaked in blood and a community turned upside down. You'll discover how love can be weaponized, how obsession masquerades as devotion, and how the people closest to victims sometimes hold the keys to solving cases that baffle investigators. And you'll witness how a single law, written in response to an unbearable loss, has since saved lives that might otherwise have been lost to the same bureaucratic delays that proved fatal before. The names you'll hear have been changed. The locations have been fictionalized. But every emotion, every investigative detail, every family's anguish, every systemic failure is rooted in the reality of cases like these that happen more often than any of us want to believe. And if you're listening to this in the dark, trying to find that edge of sleep, know that these stories matter not because they're sensational, but because they're preventable. That's what makes them so hard to process. That's what keeps investigators awake long after cases close. That's what drives families to become advocates, lawmakers to change legislation, and communities to finally ask the uncomfortable questions they've been avoiding. So settle in. This is going to take a while. But by the end, you'll understand something essential about how violence unfolds, not in the dramatic explosions we see in movies, but in the quiet accumulation of ignored warnings, dismissed concerns, and moments when someone could have intervened but didn't, not out of cruelty, but out of a system that hadn't yet learned what we're still learning now. Pine Hollow was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. The town sat in a valley in Westbridge State, surrounded by dense woods that turned golden in autumn and hostile in winter. Main Street had the usual collection of local businesses, a diner where seniors gathered for coffee every morning, a grocery store that closed at 8, and a high school whose football team was the pride of the community. It was the sort of place where people rarely locked their doors, where a crime wave meant someone's garden gnomes got stolen, and where tragedy was supposed to be something that happened to other towns, distant cities, places you saw on the news but never visited. Lena Hartman was 17 that spring. She had dark hair she usually wore in a ponytail, a smile that came easily when she wasn't worried, and dreams of studying environmental science at the state university. Her teachers described her as quietly determined, the kind of student who didn't seek attention but consistently turned in work that showed real thought. Her friends knew her as loyal, sometimes too loyal, someone who believed the best in people even when evidence suggested otherwise. Her parents, Mark and Susan Hartman, saw a daughter who'd grown up faster than they'd expected, who'd shouldered responsibilities beyond her years, and who'd recently become withdrawn in ways that worried them more than they let on. The relationship had started the previous fall. Derek Lane was 22, worked sporadically in construction, and had the kind of charm that could fill a room when he wanted it to. He'd grown up in Pine Hollow, dropped out of high school in his junior year, and had a reputation that depended entirely on who you asked. To some, he was a kid who'd had a rough start and deserved a chance. To others, he was trouble waiting to happen, someone whose temper was well known even if it hadn't yet resulted in serious legal consequences. He'd been involved in bar fights, shouting matches with ex-girlfriends, and at least one incident where police had been called to a domestic disturbance, though charges were never filed. Lena met him at a party she'd been reluctant to attend. Her friend convinced her to go, promised it would be fun, and for the first hour, it was. Music, laughter, the feeling of being somewhere adults weren't monitoring every move. Derek noticed her standing by herself near the kitchen, asked if she wanted something to drink, and started talking. He was funny that night, self-deprecating in a way that made him seem vulnerable rather than boastful. He talked about wanting to get his life together, about how he'd messed up but was working on being better. And Lena, whose instinct was always to see potential in people, to believe in redemption, found herself interested. The first few weeks were intoxicating. He texted constantly, showed up at places she mentioned she'd be, brought her small gifts that showed he'd been listening to her. Her friends had mixed reactions. Some thought he seemed genuinely into her. Others noticed how he positioned himself between Lena and other guys at parties, how his jokes about her talking to male classmates had an edge that didn't quite feel like joking. Her parents met him once, briefly, and immediately disliked him, though they struggled to articulate exactly why beyond a general sense that he was too old, too aimless, too something they couldn't quite name, but felt in their gut. By winter, the relationship had shifted. The gifts stopped. The constant texting became constant surveillance. Where was she? Who was she with? Why hadn't she responded immediately? Lena found herself explaining innocent interactions, defending friendships that predated Derek, choosing her words carefully to avoid setting him off. The first time he grabbed her arm hard enough to leave marks, he apologized so profusely, seemed so genuinely horrified at himself, that she believed it was an aberration, a one-time loss of control that wouldn't happen again. But it did happen again, and again, not always physical, though sometimes it was. More often, it was the yelling, the accusations, the way he could make her feel small and stupid and guilty for things she hadn't done. Her grades started slipping. She stopped going to environmental club meetings. She made excuses when friends invited her out. Her parents noticed, tried to talk to her, but teenagers are experts at deflection, and Lena had become very good at insisting everything was fine while her world constricted around her. In March, 2 months before everything fell apart, something shifted in Lena. Maybe it was seeing a bruise on her wrist and realizing she was becoming the kind of person she'd always pitied. Maybe it was her best friend sitting her down and saying directly what everyone had been dancing around. This isn't normal. This isn't love. This is dangerous. Maybe it was just exhaustion, the bone-deep tiredness of constantly managing someone else's emotions while neglecting her own. Whatever the reason, she decided to end it. She did it over text, which felt cowardly, but she'd learned that face-to-face conversations with Derek could escalate unpredictably. She kept it simple, direct, tried not to give him ammunition for argument. This isn't working. I need to focus on school and my future. Please respect my decision. His response came within seconds. You can't just throw away what we have. Then another. After everything I've done for you. Then, you're making a huge mistake. Then the messages turned darker. He knew where she lived. He knew her schedule. He knew where her parents worked, what car her little brother drove, which window was her bedroom. Lena showed the messages to her parents. They went to the police station together, Mark Hartman's jaw tight with barely controlled anger, Susan's hand gripping her daughter's. They sat across from an officer who listened, took notes, and explained the process for obtaining a protection order. Yes, the messages were concerning. Yes, Derek's history of volatility was noted. But had he explicitly threatened violence? Not in so many words. Had he shown up at their house? Not yet. The law required specific thresholds, concrete evidence of imminent danger. They could file for a protection order, and the officer encouraged them to do so, but he also managed expectations. These orders were pieces of paper. They established legal consequences for violation. but they didn't create force fields. The real protection came from awareness, from being cautious, from documenting everything. They filed the paperwork that day. The protection order was granted a week later. It specified that Derek Lane was to have no contact with Lena Hartman, was to stay at least 500 feet away from her home, and her school. Violation would result in arrest. The order was served to Derek at his apartment. According to the officer who delivered it, he took it calmly, said he understood, and closed the door without incident. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Lena started to breathe easier. Maybe the official nature of the order had penetrated where her own words hadn't. Maybe the threat of jail time was enough deterrent. Maybe he'd moved on, found someone else to focus on. She started going to environmental club again. Her grades ticked upward. She laughed more easily. Her parents watched this cautiously, wanting to believe the worst was over, but unable to fully relax. Susan started sleeping poorly, waking at small noises, checking that doors were locked multiple times each night. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. It was a Thursday in late April, warm enough that students were restless, counting down to summer. Lena's last class ended at 2:45. She walked out of the school building with her friend Emma, discussing their plans for an upcoming environmental fair. The parking lot was crowded with students heading to cars, buses, sports practices. It was the kind of organized chaos that happened every weekday at dismissal, adults monitoring but not hovering, teenagers moving in their familiar patterns toward whatever came next. Surveillance footage from the school's exterior cameras would later show Lena and Emma walking toward the student lot, stopping briefly while Emma dug through her backpack for her keys. The footage showed other students streaming past them. It showed teachers on duty scanning the crowd with the practiced but somewhat disengaged attention of people performing a routine task. And it showed a dark blue truck pulling into the lot from the main road, moving slowly, not stopping at the designated pickup area, but instead cruising through the section where students park their own vehicles. Emma found her keys and the two girls separated, Lena heading toward her older sedan parked near the back of the lot. The footage showed her walking alone now, backpack slung over one shoulder, phone in her hand. She appeared to be texting, head down, not paying particular attention to her surroundings. This was noted later, discussed in hushed tones as if it represented some crucial failure on her part, as if vigilance could have changed what happened next. But she was 17, in a school parking lot, surrounded by peers and teachers. When exactly are we allowed to let our guard down if not in places like that? The blue truck appeared in frame again, now moving more quickly. It pulled alongside Lena's car just as she reached for the door handle. The driver's side door of the truck opened. A figure emerged, moving fast. Lena looked up, her body language shifting immediately from casual to alarmed. She stepped back. The figure advanced. Her mouth opened, probably shouting, though the cameras had no audio. Several things happened in rapid succession that would only become clear when investigators reviewed the footage frame by frame later. Lena dropped her phone. She tried to run back toward the main cluster of students. The figure from the truck caught her by the arm, jerking her backward. She fought, visibly struggled, her free hand reaching out toward anyone who might see. And people did see, several students glancing over, but from a distance, without clear view, it might have looked like an argument, a couple fighting, something uncomfortable but not necessarily dangerous. The crucial seconds ticked by. The figure forced Lena toward the truck. She continued resisting. Then, sickeningly, she went limp, either unconscious or giving up, and was pushed into the passenger side. The truck reversed, turned, and left the parking lot at a normal speed, nothing that would draw immediate attention, nothing that suggested a kidnapping had just occurred in broad daylight with dozens of potential witnesses nearby. Emma was the first to realize something was wrong. She'd gotten into her own car and driven toward the exit, passing Lena's sedan still parked and empty. Lena wasn't answering texts. Emma circled back, parked, and walked over to the car. She found Lena's phone on the ground, screen cracked from the fall. Her backpack sat next to it. The driver's door was locked. Emma's stomach dropped. She ran back toward the school building, found a teacher, stammered out what she'd discovered. The teacher, initially dismissive in that way adults sometimes are when teenagers seem to be overreacting, became serious when Emma insisted something was very wrong. By 3:30, Lena's parents had been called. By 4 o'clock, police were reviewing surveillance footage. By 4:30, Every officer in Pine Hollow knew they were looking for Derek Lane in a dark blue truck. By 5 o'clock, Lena's face was on local news with the word missing beneath it. And by 6 o'clock, a bolo had been issued statewide because there was no pretending this was anything other than what it appeared to be: a violent abduction by someone who'd already demonstrated both motive and disregard for legal boundaries. Mark Hartman sat in the police station, his hands shaking so badly he had to clasp them together. Susan paced, unable to be still, asking the same questions over and over. Where would he take her? What did he want? How long before they found them? The police couldn't answer with certainty. Derek's apartment had been checked immediately and found empty. His truck wasn't there. His phone was off or destroyed. He had no close family in the area, few friends willing to talk to police, and no obvious destination. His employment history suggested he knew the woods around Pine Hollow well, had worked on various properties in remote areas, understood how to navigate terrain that could swallow someone if they didn't want to be found. Lena's last text messages told a story of normalcy interrupted. The last outgoing message, sent at 2:43, was to her mother. Environmental fair got approved. We can do the booth about local watershed protection. Mundane, excited, alive. That message would replay in Susan Hartman's mind thousands of times in the coming years, the absolute ordinariness of it. The way it promised a future that was already being stolen even as Lena typed the words. The first night of Lena's disappearance, volunteers gathered at the school to organize search parties. The police were clear that this wasn't a lost hiker situation, that they were likely looking for someone being held against her will, but people needed to do something. They divided into groups, took assigned sectors of the woods surrounding town, walked in lines calling her name, shining flashlights into ravines and dense undergrowth. They found nothing. No trace of the truck, no disturbed earth, no signs of struggle. The forest kept its secrets. Derek Lane's history became public knowledge in those first chaotic days. People who dismissed him as rough but harmless now remembered incidents they'd downplayed before. A woman came forward to describe a relationship with Derek 3 years earlier that had ended with him showing up at her workplace repeatedly until she threatened to call police. Another woman described being grabbed at a party when she tried to leave a conversation with him. A former employer talked about his temper, how he'd punched a wall during a dispute over scheduling. Each story individually seemed manageable, the kind of thing people wrote off as someone having a bad day or being young and stupid. Collectively, they painted a picture of escalation, of someone whose control over his own anger was deteriorating, whose relationships were characterized by possession rather than partnership. On the second day, a park ranger discovered the blue truck abandoned on a fire road 20 miles outside Pine Hollow. It had been partially concealed with branches, driven far enough off the main path that casual passers-by wouldn't notice it. The doors were unlocked. The keys were missing. Inside, investigators found more evidence than they wanted. Blood on the passenger seat, torn fabric that matched Lena's jacket, her student ID wedged between seat cushions, and scratches on the passenger door handle that suggested she'd fought even after being forced into the vehicle. The area around the truck became the focus of intensive search efforts. Cadaver dogs were brought in. State police joined local officers. Volunteers combed every inch of accessible terrain. The working theory was grim. Derek had taken Lena into the woods, done something terrible, and then disappeared on foot. He knew this area. He could survive in the wilderness for days or weeks. The question wasn't whether they'd find Lena, but when and in what condition. Mark and Susan Hartman did what parents do in impossible situations. They held press conferences pleading for information. They kept Lena's room exactly as she'd left it. They reviewed her social media for clues investigators might have missed. They existed in a state of suspended animation, unable to grieve because grief meant accepting what they weren't ready to accept, unable to hope because hope felt increasingly delusional as days turned into weeks without a breakthrough. Emma blamed herself in ways no one could talk her out of. If she'd walked with Lena all the way to her car, if she'd noticed the truck sooner, if she'd insisted Lena come home with her that afternoon instead of driving separately. The rational part of her brain understood these were meaningless what-ifs, that nothing she could have done would have changed Derek's intent, that responsibility rested solely with him. But trauma doesn't respect rationality, and she carried the weight of those final moments. The sight of Lena's phone cracked on the pavement, The terrible knowledge that her friend had been taken while she sat in her own car, oblivious, checking her own messages. The community held vigils. They tied yellow ribbons around trees. They posted "Bring Lena home" signs in windows. And they wondered, in conversations that grew more honest as shock faded into sustained anxiety, how this had happened. The protection order was discussed endlessly. Some people thought it proved the system worked. Legal boundaries were established, consequences were made clear, and look what happened anyway when someone chose to violate those boundaries. Others saw it as evidence of failure. A piece of paper couldn't stop a determined predator, and pretending it could left vulnerable people with false security. The truth, as it often is, was more complicated than either simple narrative. Weeks passed. Summer arrived. School ended. Lena's classmates graduated without her. The environmental fair happened. Her booth left empty as a tribute. Search efforts continued, but shifted from urgent rescue mission to grim recovery operation. Derek remained missing, which became its own source of community anxiety. Was he still out there, watching? Had he fled the state? The country? Or was he also dead, another casualty of whatever had transpired in those woods? Then came the discovery that changed everything, though not in the way anyone hoped. Maya Collins was 22 when she moved to Pine Hollow. She'd grown up 2 towns over, worked as a waitress at a diner on Main Street, and was known for being friendly in that effortless way some people have. She had blonde hair, usually pulled into a messy bun during her shifts, and a habit of remembering regular customers' orders before they finished speaking. She'd moved to Pine Hollow for a fresh start after a relationship ended badly, hoping that a new town and a steady job would help her rebuild her life. She rented a small apartment above a hardware store, kept to herself mostly, but was making friends slowly through work. This was 3 years after Lena disappeared. The case remained technically open, but had gone cold in the way these things do when leads dry up and new crises demand attention. The Hartman family had established a foundation in Lena's name focused on helping domestic violence victims navigate the legal system. They held annual memorial events. They kept her story alive even as the rest of the town, uncomfortable with unresolved tragedy, gradually let it recede from daily consciousness. Maya started dating Derek Lane in early fall. Except no one knew it was Derek Lane because he'd been living under a different name. He'd grown a beard. He'd gained weight. He worked construction jobs for cash under the table. He'd found a way to exist in the margins of society, careful never to get pulled into situations that required identification, never getting stopped by police, never applying for anything that would run his name through databases. And he'd settled in Pine Hollow, the last place anyone would expect him to be, hiding in plain sight in the very community that had spent months searching for him. Later, people would express disbelief that this was possible. How could he remain undiscovered in a small town where people knew each other? But the reality is that small towns have transients, temporary workers, people who drift through without putting down real roots. If you're careful, if you keep your head down and your interactions superficial, it's easier to disappear into a crowd than we like to think. And Derek had always been good at reading social situations, at becoming whoever he needed to be to avoid scrutiny. Maya met him at a community bonfire. He introduced himself as Derek Nelson, said he was new in town, working construction while he figured out his next move. He was charming that night, attentive in ways that made her feel seen. She'd been lonely, missing the support system she'd left behind, and his interest felt validating. They started seeing each other regularly. Her coworkers met him a few times when he'd pick Maya up after shifts. They described him later as polite but forgettable, the kind of guy who nodded at the right times and didn't make much of an impression either way. The relationship followed a familiar pattern, though Maya had no way of knowing that. The early intensity, the gradual isolation, the questions about who she was talking to, where she'd been, why she hadn't texted back immediately. Her friends from her previous town noticed she was calling less frequently. Her co-workers observed that she seemed more stressed, that her usual sunny disposition was clouding over. But Maya insisted everything was fine, and people respected that boundary even as they worried privately. In December, Maya stopped showing up for work. Her manager tried calling. Her phone went straight to voicemail. After 2 days of no-shows, the manager contacted the police for a wellness check. Officers went to Maya's apartment, knocked, received no answer, and finally used the landlord's key to gain entry. The apartment was neat, Nothing obviously disturbed, but Maya wasn't there. Her car was parked outside. Her purse sat on the kitchen counter. Her phone was missing. There were no signs of struggle, but also no indication she'd planned to go anywhere. The bed was unmade, like she'd gotten up that morning intending to come right back. The manager mentioned Maya had been dating someone named Derek Nelson. Police tried to locate him, but found that no one by that name was officially employed anywhere in the area, had no apartment lease, no vehicle registration, nothing. It was as if he existed only in personal interactions, but had left no paper trail. This was unusual enough to escalate concerns. Missing person reports were filed. Maya's photo appeared on local news. Her family, frantic, drove to Pine Hollow and began their own search for answers. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. One of Lena's former teachers, Mrs. Peterson, saw news coverage about Maya's disappearance. Something about the description of the boyfriend nagged at her. She couldn't articulate what exactly, just a feeling that the details felt familiar. She mentioned it to her husband, who suggested she was seeing patterns where none existed. But Mrs. Peterson couldn't let it go. She dug out old-school photos, looked at pictures from the memorial service for Lena, studied images of Derek Lane from 3 years earlier. The beard was different. The weight was different. But the eyes, the set of the jaw, something essential remained recognizable. She called the police, voiced her suspicion, and was told they'd look into it. Detective Sarah Chun, who'd worked Lena's case and never fully moved on from it, pulled the files. She studied recent photos of Derek Nelson provided by Maya's co-workers. She brought in a forensic analyst who specialized in facial recognition. And slowly, methodically, they built the case that Derek Nelson and Derek Lane were the same person. Once they had that connection, everything accelerated. An arrest warrant was issued. Police circulated updated photos. But Derek was already gone, having apparently sensed that his identity was in danger of being exposed. His various temporary living situations were checked, all empty. The construction sites where he'd worked had last seen him days earlier. Once again, he'd vanished into the landscape. This time, the search had new urgency. 2 missing women, both linked to the same man, both disappearing under circumstances that suggested violence. The state police devoted significant resources. The FBI got involved given the possibility Derek had fled across state lines. Media coverage intensified, no longer just a local story, but something that captured regional and then national attention. The Hartman family, who'd learned to live with uncertainty, now faced the reopening of wounds they'd barely managed to scar over. Mark Hartman and Maya's father, Jim Collins, met in the police station on a gray afternoon in January. They sat across from each other in a small conference room. 2 men united by the worst kind of commonality. They didn't need to say much. Mark offered what information he could about Derek's patterns, his psychology, the way he operated. Jim listened, taking notes in a small notebook he carried everywhere now, as if documentation could somehow impose order on chaos. They shook hands when Jim left, and Mark said something he'd never said to anyone outside his family. The waiting is worse than knowing. But knowing might be worse than the waiting. There's no good path from here. In February, a hunter stumbled across something that didn't belong in the woods. He was tracking deer several miles from where Derek's truck had been found years earlier, following a ridge that few people traversed because the terrain was difficult and the views unremarkable. He noticed disturbed earth, vegetation that had grown over, but not quite naturally. And when he investigated closer, he knew immediately he'd found something terrible. The police response was massive and methodical. Forensic teams, cadaver dogs, anthropologists, everyone who could contribute to a proper excavation and analysis. They set up a perimeter. They documented everything. And over the course of 2 long days, they carefully unearthed remains that would later be identified through dental records and DNA as belonging to both Lena Hartman and Maya Collins. They'd been buried together in the same grave, which suggested several things to investigators. Derek had returned to the same location. He'd known exactly where he'd left Lena's body, and he'd chosen to place Maya there as well, either out of convenience or some twisted logic that made sense only to him. The positioning of the remains suggested the killings had occurred at different times, consistent with the 3-year gap between disappearances. The condition of the remains made it impossible to determine exact causes of death, though evidence suggested significant trauma. Notification of next of kin is one of the hardest things police officers do. Detective Chun went to both families personally. She'd prepared herself for this moment many times over the years, rehearsed what she'd say, how she'd deliver news that destroys worlds. But there's no good way to tell parents their child is dead, that the worst outcome they've been dreading has been confirmed, that there's no more room for the protective cushion of uncertainty. The Hartmans collapsed into each other. The Collins family went silent, completely silent, for a time that felt eternal. Then Maya's mother started screaming, a sound Chin would hear in nightmares for years. The discovery of the bodies reignited the manhunt for Derek. He'd been missing for months now, and the real question became whether he was alive or dead. Some investigators theorized he'd killed himself, unable to live with what he'd done or afraid of being caught. Others believed he was still out there, potentially dangerous to others. The FBI added him to their most wanted list. His photo appeared everywhere, on TV, in newspapers, on social media. Tips flooded in from across the country, most of them false sightings or people with vague resemblances, but each one had to be checked. The funerals happened within days of each other. Lena's was well attended. The gym at Pine Hollow High School filled beyond capacity with people who'd known her, who'd searched for her, who'd held vigils hoping for her safe return. Emma spoke, her voice breaking, about her best friend's kindness and dreams. Lena's environmental science teacher described a student who cared deeply about the natural world and wanted to protect it. Mark Hartman stood at the podium and couldn't speak, just stood there for a long moment before Susan gently led him back to his seat. Maya's funeral was smaller, held in her hometown, attended mostly by family and friends from before her move to Pine Hollow. The waitresses from the diner came, still wearing their uniforms because they'd driven straight from work. They'd created a memorial book with customer comments about Maya, little notes about how she'd made people's days better with small kindnesses, remembered birthdays, asked about sick relatives. The manager who'd called for that wellness check spoke about Maya's work ethic and warmth, and then broke down completely, unable to continue. The investigation continued even with Lena and Maya laid to rest. Derek was out there somewhere, and finding him became an obsession for those working the case. Detective Chun pulled double shifts, reviewing evidence, coordinating with other agencies, following leads that went nowhere more often than not. The case file grew to thousands of pages. The timeline of Derek's movements over 7 years, from his initial relationship with Lena through his reemergence in Pine Hollow, had been reconstructed in painstaking detail. Psychological profiles were developed trying to understand his motivation, his ability to compartmentalize, his apparent capacity to reinvent himself and form new relationships even while keeping terrible secrets. What emerged was a picture of someone who'd likely been escalating for years. The bar fights, the past relationships marked by control and volatility, the incident reports that never quite resulted in serious consequences. Each time, he'd been given another chance, had moved to a new situation, had convinced people he was trying to improve. And each time, the underlying patterns remained, growing more dangerous as he refined his ability to manipulate both individuals and systems. In May, 8 months after Maya disappeared, Derek was found. Not caught exactly, but found. A couple hiking in a remote area of the national forest, nearly 100 miles from Pine Hollow, came across a small cave formation. They noticed a terrible smell and saw what they initially thought was an animal carcass. But the clothing was human. The body was in advanced decomposition but identifiable through distinctive tattoos and jewelry that Derek had worn. A medical examiner would later determine he'd been dead for several months, possibly since shortly after Maya's disappearance became public. The manner of death appeared to be suicide, though the condition of the remains made definitive determination difficult. He'd chosen a location far from civilization, somewhere he'd be unlikely to be discovered quickly. There was no note, no explanation, no confession or apology, just an end that felt anticlimactic after so much searching, so much fear that he might harm others, so much investment in bringing him to justice. The family's reactions were complicated. There was relief that he couldn't hurt anyone else. There was frustration that there would be no trial, no opportunity to confront him, no chance to hear him explain why. There was anger that he'd taken the easy way out, if suicide can be called easy. And there was the hollow recognition that nothing about this outcome would bring Lena or Maya back, would undo their suffering, would restore the futures they'd been denied. Susan Hartman said something in an interview that resonated with a lot of people following the case. She was asked if she felt closure now that Derek was dead. She paused, really thought about the question, and then said, "Closure is something people need to believe exists because the alternative is too hard. We don't have closure. We have an end to one kind of suffering and the beginning of another. We have information instead of questions, which is different, but not better exactly. We have his death, but we don't have understanding. And we'll never have our daughter back, which is the only thing that would actually matter. The trials that never happened meant some questions remained unanswered. The exact circumstances of how Lena died. Whether Maya knew who Derek really was before the end. Where he'd been hiding during those 3 years. How many people he'd interacted with who might have suspected something, but said nothing. The grave site revealed some information through forensic analysis, but death tells only part of a story, and the living parts, the moments of fear and realization and final thoughts, died with the victims and their killer. Pine Hollow tried to move forward. The town held a dedication ceremony for a memorial garden honoring both Lena and Maya. It was placed near the high school, visible to students every day, a reminder of lives cut short and the importance of looking out for each other. The Hartman Foundation expanded its mission to include education about the warning signs of dangerous relationships, the limits of legal protections, and the need for community awareness. They trained counselors, provided resources to schools, funded emergency shelter space for domestic violence victims. But trauma doesn't resolve neatly. Emma never quite forgave herself, despite therapy, despite everyone telling her repeatedly that nothing was her fault. She became an advocate against intimate partner violence, channeling her guilt into action, speaking at schools about what she'd witnessed and missed. Other students from Lena's class carried their own forms of damage. Some became hypervigilant in their own relationships, unable to trust. Others avoided serious dating entirely, terrified of making the wrong choice. The investigating officers dealt with their own aftermath. Detective Chun took a leave of absence after Derek's body was found. She'd poured years into this case, had promised Lena's parents she'd find answers, and when those answers finally came, they felt insufficient. She'd imagined confronting Derek, getting him to confess not just to the crimes, but to his thinking, understanding the psychology that allowed someone to kill and then calmly exist among the people searching for his victims. Instead, there was just a body in a cave and silence. The protection order that Lena had obtained became a symbol in debates about domestic violence prevention. Some advocates pointed to it as evidence that the legal system provided tools but couldn't guarantee safety, that we needed better enforcement and more resources. Others argued it proved that pieces of paper couldn't stop determined abusers, that we needed entirely different approaches focusing on early intervention and changing cultural attitudes about relationships and power. The reality, frustratingly, was that both perspectives had merit and neither provided a complete solution. In the years after the case closed, various journalists and documentarians reached out to the families for interviews. Most were declined. The Hartmans released a statement through their foundation explaining they'd told their story enough times, that constantly revisiting the worst moments of their lives served no purpose beyond public curiosity, and that their energy was better spent on prevention than reflection. The Collins family made no public statements at all, retreating into private grief. But occasionally, Susan Hartman would speak at events focused on domestic violence awareness. She'd show pictures of Lena as a little girl, as a teenager with dreams. She'd read from Lena's journal entries about wanting to study watersheds, about caring for the environment. She described the ordinary details of their last normal day together. And then she described the protection order, the police response, the systems that had operated as designed but failed anyway. She never assigned blame to individuals. She focused on gaps, on things we don't talk about enough, on the difference between legal intervention and actual safety. One thing Susan always emphasized: Derek didn't suddenly become dangerous. The warning signs had been there for years. Multiple women had experienced his controlling behavior, his temper, his inability to accept boundaries. But each incident existed in isolation. No database connected them. No system tracked the pattern. Women who'd escaped him didn't know about each other, couldn't compare notes, couldn't see the escalation that became obvious only in retrospect. By the time Lena encountered him, he'd refined his approach, learned from previous failures, become better at hiding the danger until it was too late to escape easily. This became Susan's mission, creating better information sharing, breaking down the silos that allowed dangerous people to move between jurisdictions and relationships without their full history following them. It was complicated work, touching on privacy concerns and legal limitations. But she persisted, motivated by the knowledge that somewhere, someone was entering a relationship with a person whose past victims could warn them if only the mechanisms existed. The memorial garden in Pine Hollow bloomed each spring. Students used it as a place to study, to have lunch, to have quiet conversations on difficult days. The plaques for Lena and Maya sat near a bench, their photos showing them smiling, alive, full of potential. Teachers brought classes there to discuss healthy relationships, consent, the importance of trusting your instincts. Some students rolled their eyes, impatient with lessons that felt preachy. Others paid close attention, seeing their own relationships reflected in the warning signs being described. And every April, on the anniversary of Lena's abduction, the Hartman family returned to lay flowers. They'd stand there quietly, remembering. Sometimes other people joined them, former classmates or teachers or community members who couldn't quite let go. The gathering was informal, no speeches or structured memorial. Just people showing up, bearing witness, refusing to let Lena and Maya be forgotten. Mrs. Peterson, the teacher who'd recognized Derek despite his disguise, often came to these gatherings. She'd blamed herself for not seeing the danger when Lena was her student, for not recognizing the signs of an abusive relationship even though looking back, they seemed so obvious. Susan Hartman had told her repeatedly that she'd saved lives by making the connection to Maya's case, that her vigilance had ended the investigation months sooner than it might have otherwise. But gratitude and guilt aren't opposites, and Mrs. Peterson carried both. The case files eventually went into storage. New investigations demanded Detective Chen's attention, new victims needed advocates, new threats emerged. But Pine Hollow never quite returned to its pre-tragedy innocence. The town had learned something about itself, about the darkness that could exist in familiar places, about how violence often wears a familiar face. Doors got locked more consistently. Parents paid closer attention to who their children dated. People were quicker to report concerns, less willing to mind their own business when something felt wrong. Whether this heightened vigilance prevented other tragedies is impossible to say. No crimes that didn't happen get recorded, no near misses generate headlines. But in quiet conversations at the diner, in parent meetings at the school, people talked about relationships differently. The phrase "that's just how he is" was challenged more often. The assumption that someone would leave an unhealthy relationship if they really wanted to face more pushback. Understanding grew, imperfect and incomplete, but real. Years later, a reporter asked Mark Hartman if he thought the system had failed Lena. He was quiet for a long time before answering. Then he said, "The system did what it was designed to do. It processed our complaint, issued the protection order, responded when she went missing. The failure was deeper than procedure. It's that we've built systems assuming the worst thing that can happen is that we might restrict someone's freedom unfairly. And yes, that's a real concern. But we haven't balanced it against the reality that hesitation kills people. I'm not saying I have the answer, how to balance safety and liberty, prevention and overreach. But I know my daughter warned everyone who'd listen that she was in danger. And she was right. And she still died. That has to mean something." Harborview sat on the coast in East Shore State, a city of about 60,000 people known for its fishing industry, tourist beaches, and university. The town had a salt-worn charm, buildings that had weathered decades of ocean air, a main street that catered to locals in winter and tourists in summer. It was the kind of place where people moved for work or school, but often stayed for the slower pace. The sense of community, the sound of waves that became so constant you stopped noticing until you traveled somewhere silent and realized what you'd been hearing all along. Eliza Monroe was 21 that October, working part-time at a bookstore near campus while studying early childhood education at the university. She had a 4-year-old son, Mason, whose father hadn't been in the picture since before the boy was born. Eliza lived with her parents, Tom and Linda Monroe, in a small house about a mile from the beach. She was the kind of young mother who juggled classes, work, and parenting with determined optimism, who brought her son to study groups because childcare fell through, who made jokes about surviving on coffee and determination. Her friends described her as resilient, Someone who'd faced challenges that would have broken others, but found ways to keep moving forward. She adored Mason, her whole face lighting up when she talked about him, when she showed photos of his latest drawings or recounted something funny he'd said. Her parents had stepped up significantly, providing housing and help with childcare so Eliza could finish her degree. The arrangement wasn't without friction, 3 adults and a preschooler in a small space, different ideas about parenting and boundaries. But they made it work through love and mutual commitment to giving Mason and Eliza stable futures. On a Friday night in late October, Eliza had plans to go out with friends. Nothing elaborate, just drinks at a bar near campus, a chance to be 21 instead of a mom and student for a few hours. Her mother agreed to watch Mason overnight. Eliza got ready, posting photos to social media in that casual way people do, documenting the ordinary evening that would soon become anything but. She wore jeans and a green sweater, her dark hair down, smiling at the camera in her childhood bedroom. The photos showed someone happy, relaxed, anticipating a good night. She met 3 friends at the bar around 9. They grabbed a table near the back, ordered drinks, caught up on classes and dating drama and work frustrations. Security footage from the bar showed them laughing, normal group dynamics, nothing to suggest any problems. Eliza's phone record showed she texted her mom at 10:30. "Having fun, Mason, okay?" Linda responded, "Sound asleep. Don't worry, enjoy yourself." It was the last text Eliza sent. Around 11:30, Eliza told her friends she was heading home. She'd had 2 drinks over the course of the evening, not enough to impair her significantly. She had an 8 a.m. shift at the bookstore the next morning and wanted to get sleep. Her friends offered to walk with her to her car, but she waved them off. It was a short distance, the area was well lit, and Harborview wasn't known for violent crime. She hugged them goodbye, grabbed her jacket, and left through the front door. The bar's exterior camera showed her walking to the parking lot adjacent to the building. She reached her car, a small older sedan parked under a streetlight. She opened the driver's door, got in, and sat there for a moment, likely checking her phone or adjusting the music or any of the small tasks people do before driving. The camera angle didn't capture what happened next clearly, but something caused her to get back out of the car suddenly. A figure approached from off-camera. There appeared to be a brief interaction. Then nothing, because the camera's field of view didn't extend to that corner of the lot. When Eliza didn't come home that night, Linda wasn't immediately worried. She assumed Eliza had decided to stay with friends, maybe had more drinks, and chosen not to drive. By morning, when Eliza still wasn't home and wasn't answering calls, concern grew. By noon, when Eliza missed her work shift and the bookstore called looking for her, alarm bells were ringing loudly. Tom and Linda drove to the bar where Eliza had been, found her car still in the parking lot. The car was locked. Tom used the spare key Eliza kept at home to open it. What they found inside froze them both. Blood on the driver's seat, soaked into the fabric, more than could be explained by a small cut or nosebleed. Eliza's purse was in the passenger seat, her phone inside it. Her keys were missing. There were no signs of struggle inside the vehicle, but the blood made clear that something violent had occurred. Tom called 911 with shaking hands. Linda stood beside the car, unable to look at the blood but unable to look away, her mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Police arrived quickly, secured the scene, called for forensic teams. By early afternoon, Eliza's photo was on every news channel in the region. "Missing woman, foul play suspected," scrolled beneath her smiling face. That photo from hours before when the night held only promise. The investigation moved quickly because everyone knew time was critical. The blood in the car was tested immediately, confirmed to be Eliza's. The amount suggested she'd been seriously injured. Detectives interviewed her friends, reconstructed her movements that evening, reviewed every second of available surveillance footage. The parking lot camera had limitations, but combined with traffic cameras nearby, investigators could piece together part of what happened. A vehicle had been caught on camera leaving the parking lot shortly after Eliza walked to her car. It was a dark sedan, hard to determine the exact make and model from the grainy footage, but distinctive enough that investigators hoped someone would recognize it. The car had turned north, onto a road that led away from downtown and toward the industrial areas along the waterfront. After that, it disappeared from any camera coverage. The community response was immediate and massive. Volunteers organized search parties. though police were careful about where they sent civilians given that this was clearly a criminal investigation, not a lost person scenario. Flyers with Eliza's photo appeared everywhere. Local businesses offered rewards for information. The university canceled classes, turning the campus center into a coordination hub. And on social media, the story went viral, shared thousands of times, comments filled with theories and outrage and fear. Tom and Linda Monroe became the public face of the search. They held press conferences, standing behind podiums looking shell-shocked, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Linda struggled to speak without breaking down, describing her daughter's dreams of becoming a kindergarten teacher, her devotion to Mason. Tom stood rigid, anger barely contained beneath the surface, directing his fury at whoever had hurt his daughter. And Mason, too young to understand fully but old enough to know something terrible had happened, kept asking when Mommy was coming home. The first major lead came from an unexpected source. A woman who worked late shifts at a convenience store about 5 miles from the bar came forward 2 days into the investigation. She'd seen the news coverage, recognized the dark sedan from security footage. A car matching that description had pulled into her store's parking lot around midnight on the Friday Eliza disappeared. She remembered because the driver had acted strangely, parking in the back of the lot rather than near the entrance, sitting in the car for several minutes before leaving without ever coming inside. More importantly, her store had security cameras with better quality than the bar's. The footage clearly showed the vehicle's license plate. Within hours, police had identified the registered owner, Caleb Ross, a 34-year-old warehouse worker who lived in Harborview. He had a criminal history, primarily drug-related offenses, but nothing violent on his record. Still, his name gave investigators a target, someone to locate and question. Finding Caleb proved more difficult than expected. He'd called in sick to work on Saturday, the day after Eliza disappeared, and hadn't been seen since. His apartment was empty, though it didn't look like he'd moved out, just stepped away. His phone was off. His bank accounts showed no recent activity. It was as if he'd known investigators were coming and had disappeared strategically. The media coverage intensified. Caleb's photo appeared alongside Eliza's. He was described as a person of interest, that careful legal phrasing that suggests suspicion without making accusations that could compromise a future trial. Tips flooded in from people who thought they'd seen him, from former co-workers and acquaintances providing character assessments that ranged from quiet guy, kept to himself, to always gave me creepy vibes. Tom Monroe struggled with the waiting, the not knowing. He couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, existed in a state of barely controlled panic. He printed maps of the area, marked off sections he'd searched personally, driving back roads and checking abandoned buildings despite police asking him to leave the investigation to professionals. Linda focused on Mason, trying to maintain some normalcy for the child, while dealing with her own terror about what might have happened to her daughter. They couldn't tell Mason that Mommy might be dead, but they couldn't tell him she was definitely coming home either. So they existed in awful limbo, saying things like, "Mommy's on a trip," while trying not to cry. On the 5th day after Eliza disappeared, a fisherman noticed something wrong near a boat launch in a remote area north of Harborview. A burned vehicle sat partially concealed by trees, clearly abandoned, charred beyond easy recognition. He called the authorities. When investigators arrived and ran the VIN, they confirmed it was Caleb Ross's car. It had been thoroughly burned. Whoever torched it had been thorough about destroying evidence. But fires rarely destroy everything. Forensic teams processed the vehicle carefully. Inside, they found traces of blood that preliminary tests suggested matched Eliza's DNA. They found other evidence too, material that suggested a body had been in the trunk. But no body was recovered from the scene. The car had been burned, then abandoned. Caleb had clearly moved on from there, but to where? The community held a vigil that night in downtown Harborview, hundreds of people gathering despite rain, holding candles that sputtered in the wind, praying for Eliza's safe return even as hope became increasingly irrational. Linda Monroe stood at the front, clutching a photo of Eliza and Mason, her voice barely audible as she thanked people for coming. Tom stood separate from the crowd, his face contorted with rage and grief, unable to participate in what felt like giving up, unable to accept that vigils were what you did when someone was dead. The investigation continued through every resource available. Caleb's phone records were subpoenaed and analyzed, showing calls and texts that painted a disturbing picture. He'd been watching Eliza. Phone records placed him near her apartment, near the bookstore where she worked, near the bar that Friday night. He'd never interacted with her directly as far as anyone could determine. She didn't know him, but he'd clearly fixated on her, for reasons that might never be fully understood. Detectives interviewed everyone in Caleb's life, trying to understand him, to predict where he might go, what he might do next. He'd grown up in Harborview, had a troubled childhood marked by neglect and petty crime, had cycled through jobs and relationships without maintaining anything stable. People described him as socially awkward, someone who'd say inappropriate things without seeming to understand why others reacted negatively. A former girlfriend described a relationship that ended badly when his possessiveness became suffocating, though she'd never felt physically threatened. What emerged was a profile of someone isolated, resentful, with a distorted understanding of relationships and entitlement. He'd followed Eliza's social media, had dozens of her photos saved on his phone, had apparently built an entire fantasy relationship in his mind despite never speaking to her. The attack seemed to have been opportunistic, seeing her alone in that parking lot, seeing a chance to act on obsessions he'd been nurturing for months. Weeks turned into months. The burned car had been their biggest lead, but it led nowhere. Caleb had vanished as completely as Eliza. The Monroes existed in agonizing uncertainty, unable to grieve properly without a body, without confirmation, but unable to hope rationally either. Mason stopped asking when Mommy was coming home and started asking different questions that were somehow harder. Did Mommy not want to stay with us? Tom and Linda struggled to answer honestly while protecting his innocence. Then came the lead that broke everything open. A hiker in a state forest about 40 miles from Harborview noticed disturbed ground in an area off the main trails. Something about it looked wrong, too deliberately altered to be natural. He marked the location on his GPS and reported it to park rangers, who contacted police. A team went to investigate and found what they'd been dreading: a shallow grave containing human remains. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. The remains were Eliza's. The cause of death was determined to be severe blunt force trauma and blood loss consistent with the evidence from her car. She'd been killed that Friday night, likely shortly after being taken, and buried in a location Caleb apparently knew well, far from where anyone was actively searching. The medical examiner couldn't determine if she'd been conscious after the initial attack, couldn't say how long she'd suffered. Some mercies remain unknowable. The Monroes received notification before the news went public. Detective Williams, who'd led the investigation, drove to their house personally. He'd done notifications before, but this one was different. He'd spent months with this family, had seen their hope erode gradually, had watched Mason ask questions no child should have to ask. He sat in their living room and told them what they'd been preparing to hear, but could never actually be ready for. Linda made a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like air being forced from lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. Tom just nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting for this, as if some part of him had known all along. The funeral was held on a gray November morning. The church was packed beyond capacity, people standing in the aisles and gathering outside, united in grief and outrage. Eliza's friends spoke about her determination, her love for her son, her optimism even in difficult circumstances. Her professors from the university described a dedicated student who would have been an exceptional teacher. And Linda, somehow finding the strength, stood and spoke directly to Mason, telling him about his mother in ways he could understand, making sure he'd have these words when he was old enough to comprehend what he'd lost. Meanwhile, the manhunt for Caleb intensified. He'd successfully evaded capture for months, but finding Eliza's body provided new forensic evidence that tied him definitively to the murder. The charges were upgraded, the resources expanded, the pressure on law enforcement to resolve this publicly and decisively grew. The FBI's involvement increased, treating this now as a fugitive case with interstate implications. Caleb was finally located in a small town in a neighboring state, living in a rundown motel under a false name, working cash jobs, existing in the margins. He'd shaved his head, grown a beard, lost weight. But a tip from someone who'd seen his photo on a true crime show led police to his location. They moved fast, worried he'd run again. A tactical team surrounded the motel at dawn, called for him to surrender. He gave up without resistance, walked out with his hands up, looking exhausted and almost relieved. The trial, when it finally happened, was a study in contrast between the enormity of the crime and the smallness of the man who committed it. Caleb sat at the defense table looking diminished, detached, occasionally making notes, but mostly staring at nothing. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The surveillance footage placing his car at the scene, the blood evidence linking Eliza to his vehicle, his own phone records establishing stalking behavior, the location data putting him near where her body was found. His defense attorneys didn't seriously contest guilt, but focused on mitigating factors, on their client's troubled background, on arguing against the death penalty. The prosecution walked the jury through that Friday night, reconstructing Eliza's final hours. They showed her social media posts, her texts to her mother, the security footage of her walking to her car. They explained how Caleb had followed her to the bar, had waited in the parking lot, had approached her when she was alone and vulnerable. They described the attack, clinical and detailed, forcing the jury to understand the violence inflicted. And they called Tom and Linda Monroe to testify about the impact, about Mason's grief, about a family destroyed by one man's inexplicable obsession. Caleb's attorneys tried various strategies. They suggested their client had mental health issues that diminished his culpability. They pointed to his troubled childhood as an explanatory factor. They argued that while the crime was terrible, their client wasn't a monster, just a damaged person who'd made catastrophic choices. But nothing they said could erase the evidence, couldn't explain away the planning that preceded the attack, couldn't justify the months of evading justice while a family suffered. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, concealment of a body. Tom Monroe sat in the courtroom, stone-faced, as the verdict was read. Linda cried quietly. Neither showed satisfaction exactly. There was no joy in this outcome, no sense that justice had somehow balanced the scales. Their daughter was still dead. Mason still asked for his mother. The guilty verdict was necessary, but it solved nothing that actually mattered. Sentencing came weeks later. The prosecution sought life without parole. The defense argued for the possibility of eventual release, however distant. The judge listened to impact statements, to arguments about precedent and proportionality, and ultimately sentenced Caleb Ross to life in prison with no possibility of parole. He would die behind bars, would never walk freely again, would spend whatever decades remained watching his life expire in a cell. Caleb finally spoke at sentencing, his first substantive words during the trial. He stood, read from a prepared statement, apologized to the Monroe family in language that felt hollow, more about mitigating his guilt than acknowledging their pain. He claimed he didn't understand what had come over him, that he'd been struggling with thoughts he couldn't control, that he wished he could undo everything. The Monroes didn't react visibly. They'd stopped expecting anything meaningful from him long ago. Life in prison should have been the end of the story. But 2 years into his sentence, Caleb Ross was found dead in his cell, apparent suicide, hanging from a makeshift noose. The prison investigation found no evidence of foul play, though plenty of people would have been happy to see him suffer. He'd left no note, no explanation. He simply chose exit rather than enduring decades of confinement. The Monroes learned about his death through a phone call from the prosecutor. Their reactions were complicated and contradictory. Relief that he was gone. Anger that he denied them the knowledge that he was suffering appropriate consequences. Frustration at another thing stolen. The ability to know he was alive and imprisoned while Eliza remained dead. Linda said later that she didn't care much either way. He was alive or dead, but that didn't change anything for them. Tom admitted to a dark satisfaction, though he felt guilty about it, unsure if wanting someone dead made him a bad person or just a grieving father. Mason was 7 when Caleb died, old enough to understand more, but still struggling with the permanence of loss. His grandparents had been raising him, providing stability and love, trying to fill the massive hole left by Eliza's death. They kept her alive in stories, in photos around the house, in visits to her grave where Mason would talk to his mom about school and friends and the things he was learning. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was what they could offer. The case became a focal point for discussions about stalking, about how easily someone can fixate on another person in the age of social media, about the limitations of law enforcement in preventing crimes that emerge from obsessive psychology rather than clear threats. Eliza had never known Caleb existed. She'd never been warned about him, had no protection order to file, no prior relationship to establish danger. He was a stranger who decided she should be his, and when reality didn't cooperate with his fantasy, he destroyed her. Advocates pushed for better stalking laws, for ways to identify and intervene with individuals showing dangerous fixation patterns before they escalate to violence. But the challenges were immense. How do you monitor everyone's social media behavior? How do you distinguish between harmless crushes and dangerous obsession? How do you restrict someone's freedom based on thoughts rather than actions? The questions had no easy answers, and Eliza's death became one more data point in ongoing debates about privacy, safety, and prevention. Years later, a journalist asked Tom Monroe if knowing who killed his daughter and seeing him convicted brought any peace. Tom was quiet for a long time, looking at photos of Eliza with Mason, at the life that should have continued. Then he said, "Peace isn't the right word. We have answers, which is more than some families get. We know she didn't suffer long, that it was quick. We know the person responsible paid a price. But none of that brings her back or gives Mason his mother. So no, there's no peace. There's just going on living because that's what you do, because Mason needs us, because Eliza would want us to keep going. But peaceful? No, we're not peaceful." Silver Palms existed in that particular kind of sprawl common to Southlake State, where the desert met planned communities, where every house looked vaguely similar and shopping centers replicated themselves every few miles. The city was young, full of families who'd relocated for jobs or weather, people from somewhere else trying to build something new. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved but didn't necessarily know each other's names, where people moved for opportunity but sometimes found isolation instead. Noah Feldman was 22 when he met Riley Knox. He'd graduated from a local college the previous spring with a degree in graphic design, was working freelance while trying to build a client base, and lived in a modest apartment near downtown. He was quiet, creative, the kind of person who expressed himself better through images than words. His parents lived 2 hours away in another part of the state, worried about him living alone but respecting his need for independence. Riley was a year younger, working retail while taking classes part-time. They'd met at a coffee shop where Riley worked. Noah came in regularly, always ordered the same thing, always sat in the corner working on his laptop. Riley started conversations, gradually learned about Noah's work, expressed interest in his designs. The attention felt good to Noah, who'd been lonely, who'd struggled socially since moving to Silver Palms. When Riley asked for his number, he gave it gladly. The relationship developed quickly, intensely. Riley texted constantly, wanted to spend every free moment together, said things like, "I've never felt this way about anyone," within weeks of their first date. To Noah, who'd had limited relationship experience, this felt like passion, like the kind of connection people described in movies. His friends had concerns. They'd met Riley a few times and noted something off, a possessiveness that seemed disproportionate to how long they'd been together, a way of speaking for Noah rather than letting him speak for himself. But when friends voiced concerns, Noah defended Riley. Everyone is different in relationships. What seems intense from outside feels natural from within. Riley was affectionate, attentive, made Noah feel seen in ways he hadn't before. The fact that Riley wanted so much of his time felt validating rather than smothering. When Riley suggested Noah shouldn't spend so much time with friends who didn't support their relationship, Noah accepted the logic. When Riley expressed hurt that Noah's family didn't immediately embrace them, Noah felt caught between two loyalties and chose the one that seemed to need him most. The isolation happened gradually, too slowly to recognize as a pattern while in the middle of it. Noah stopped going to design meetups. He turned down invitations from college friends. He called his parents less frequently, and when he did, he edited out the complicated parts, the arguments with Riley that left him confused and apologetic without understanding quite what he was apologizing for. He told himself this was normal, that relationships required compromise, that Riley's needs weren't unreasonable even when meeting them felt exhausting. The first time Riley threatened self-harm, Noah was terrified. They'd had an argument about something minor. Noah couldn't even remember what later, and Riley had responded by saying maybe everyone would be better off if they just disappeared. Noah had immediately backed down from whatever position he'd been taking, had reassured and comforted and promised to be better. The crisis passed, but it established a template. Disagreement led to Riley's emotional volatility, which led to Noah's capitulation to restore equilibrium. It was a cycle that became familiar, then normal, then inescapable. By winter, Noah's freelance work had suffered. He missed deadlines because Riley needed him. He turned down projects because they would require time Riley wasn't willing to share. His savings dwindled. His parents noticed he seemed different when they called, strained and preoccupied. They invited him to visit, hoping to talk to him away from Riley's influence. But Riley made such visits difficult, creating crises that required Noah to cancel plans or cut trips short. The breaking point came gradually. Noah's friend Marcus, who'd known him since college, showed up at Noah's apartment unannounced one afternoon when Riley was at work. He'd been worried, had texted without response for weeks, had finally decided direct intervention was necessary. He found Noah looking exhausted, thinner than he'd been months earlier, the apartment messy in ways that suggested someone who'd stopped caring about their environment. Marcus didn't mince words. He told Noah he was worried, that the relationship looked unhealthy from outside, that isolation and constant crisis weren't normal relationship dynamics. Noah initially defended Riley, reflexively, but Marcus persisted. He asked questions. Did Noah feel free to make his own choices? Did he feel happy? When was the last time he'd done something just for himself? And slowly, reluctantly, Noah admitted that no, he wasn't happy, hadn't been for a while, but didn't know how to fix it without making things worse. They talked for hours. Marcus didn't push Noah to end the relationship immediately, understood that had to be Noah's decision, but planted seeds of doubt about whether what he was experiencing was actually love. He reminded Noah who he'd been before Riley, the dreams he'd had, the person he'd wanted to become. And he made Noah promise to call anytime, day or night, if he needed support. That conversation stayed with Noah. He started noticing things he'd been rationalizing. The way Riley went through his phone, the accusations about innocent interactions with others, the emotional manipulation disguised as vulnerability, the constant requirement to prioritize Riley's needs while his own were dismissed as selfish. It accumulated until the weight became unbearable. In March, Noah decided to end the relationship. He knew it wouldn't be easy, had witnessed enough of Riley's reactions to know pushback was coming. He tried to plan for a clean break up in a public place, be clear and firm, have friends available for support afterward. But when the moment came, his resolve wavered. He couldn't do it face to face, couldn't withstand what he knew would be Riley's tears and accusations and threats. So he chose text, imperfect and cowardly maybe, but safer. He sent the message on a Wednesday evening. I can't do this anymore. We're not good for each other. I need space to figure out my life. Please respect this. Then he turned off his phone, knowing the immediate response would be overwhelming, giving himself time to breathe before dealing with consequences. Riley's initial texts, which Noah saw later, were predictable. Disbelief, anger, pleading. Then threats became more explicit. Threats to self-harm. Claims that Noah was abandoning someone who'd given up everything for him. Statements that if Riley couldn't have him, maybe life wasn't worth living. The messages escalated in desperation and manipulation over the course of hours. But Noah's phone was off. He didn't see them in real time. He spent that evening with Marcus, trying to process his decision, alternating between relief and guilt. They ordered food, watched movies, tried to establish normalcy. Marcus told Noah he was proud of him, that the hard part was over, that rebuilding would take time, but was possible. Noah wanted to believe that. Around midnight, Noah decided to check his messages, to see how bad the fallout was. His phone exploded with notifications, dozens of texts, missed calls, voicemails. He started reading, felt the familiar pull of guilt and responsibility. Riley's pain was real, even if the relationship had been unhealthy. Maybe he should call, explain better, make sure Riley was okay. Marcus warned against it, reminded Noah that responding would restart the cycle. But Noah felt responsible for Riley's well-being in ways that were hard to articulate. While they were debating what to do, someone knocked on Noah's door. Loud, insistent. Noah went to answer it, Marcus following. Through the peephole, he saw Riley standing in the hallway. His stomach dropped. How had Riley gotten his address? Had he mentioned it? Riley knocked again, calling Noah's name, voice audible through the door, saying they needed to talk, that Noah couldn't just throw away what they had, that Riley deserved an explanation. Noah didn't open the door. He called through it, said he didn't want to talk, that the relationship was over, that Riley needed to leave. But Riley didn't leave. Riley stayed in the hallway, alternating between pleading and yelling, making enough noise that neighbors would certainly hear. Marcus suggested calling the police, but Noah hesitated, worried about escalating, about what that would mean for Riley, whether he was overreacting. Then Riley said something that changed the calculation. "If you don't open this door, you're going to regret it. I swear to God. Noah, open the door, or I'll do something you can't take back." The threat was ambiguous enough to deny, but clear enough to frighten. Marcus called 911 while Noah stayed at the door, trying to keep Riley talking, worried about what might happen if they left, or if police took too long to arrive. Police arrived within 10 minutes that felt much longer. Officers knocked, identified themselves, ordered Riley to step away from the door. There was resistance initially, Riley arguing this was a private matter, that Noah was his boyfriend, that police had no business interfering. But the officers were firm, told Riley that creating a disturbance and threatening someone were not protected activities regardless of relationship status. Riley was escorted from the building, given a warning about trespassing, and told to leave Noah alone. After police left, Noah collapsed onto his couch, shaking. Marcus sat beside him, saying nothing, just present. Noah felt relieved and terrified simultaneously, grateful the immediate crisis was over, but aware this wouldn't be the end. Riley wouldn't accept this outcome quietly. The relationship might be over, but the complications were just beginning. Noah barely slept that night. Every noise in the apartment building made him jump, convinced Riley had returned. Marcus stayed over, refusing to leave Noah alone despite having work the next morning. They talked until dawn about next steps, changing locks, documenting everything, considering a restraining order. It all felt surreal to Noah, who'd never imagined his life would involve police and legal protections, who'd thought breaking up would be painful but straightforward. In the morning, Noah's phone showed more messages from Riley, sent after the police encounter. The tone had shifted from pleading to accusatory. "You called the cops on me? After everything we've been through. You've ruined my life. This isn't over." Noah screenshot everything, documenting at Marcus's insistence, though it felt paranoid and unnecessary. Surely Riley would calm down eventually. Surely this intensity would fade. But Riley didn't calm down. Over the next days, the messages continued. Riley showed up at the coffee shop where they'd first met, waited for hours even though Noah never came. Riley contacted Noah's clients, sending messages claiming Noah was unreliable, trying to damage the freelance business Noah was trying to rebuild. Riley created fake social media accounts to monitor Noah's activity after being blocked on official ones. The harassment was relentless and creative, finding new avenues every time one was closed off. Noah's parents, finally understanding the full situation, urged him to get a restraining order immediately. His father wanted him to move back home temporarily. His mother called daily, anxious and angry that her son was dealing with this. But Noah resisted initially, clinging to belief that Riley would eventually move on, that legal intervention would only inflame the situation. He'd internalized so much guilt about the relationship ending that taking formal action felt cruel, even knowing rationally that Riley's behavior was unacceptable. The decision was made for him 2 weeks after the initial breakup. Noah came home from meeting with a client to find his apartment door slightly ajar. His stomach lurched. He called Marcus instead of entering, waited outside until his friend arrived. Together they pushed the door open fully. The apartment had been ransacked. Drawers pulled out, possessions scattered, personal items destroyed. His computer, essential for his work, was smashed. Photos were torn from walls, and written on the bathroom mirror in what looked like lipstick, "You don't get to leave me." This time, Noah didn't hesitate to call police. Officers took reports, dusted for prints, documented the damage with photographs. They asked if he had suspicions about who was responsible. Noah explained the situation with Riley, showed them the text messages, described the escalating harassment. The officers were sympathetic and explained the process for obtaining an emergency restraining order. They couldn't arrest Riley yet without concrete proof of the break-in. but they could help Noah establish legal boundaries and would respond quickly if those boundaries were violated. The restraining order was granted the next day. Riley was served at work, according to the sheriff's report, and had reacted badly, claiming Noah was lying, that this was all a misunderstanding, that Noah was the one who'd initiated all contact. But the evidence told a different story, and the order stood: no contact, stay at least 1,000 feet away, cease all harassment immediate. For a few days, things were quiet. Noah started to breathe easier, began cleaning up his apartment, replaced his destroyed computer with help from his parents. He reconnected with friends he'd neglected, started accepting new design projects, tried to rebuild the life that had been constricted by the relationship. Marcus helped him change the locks, install a security camera by his door, set up alerts on his phone for suspicious activity. The measures felt excessive but necessary. Then came the night that demonstrated just how dangerous Riley had become. Noah woke to his phone ringing at 3 in the morning. The number was unfamiliar. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. The voice on the other end was Riley's mother, Mrs. Knox, frantic and apologetic. Riley had shown up at her house hours earlier, agitated and talking incoherently about Noah. She tried to calm Riley down, but the situation had escalated. Riley had taken a knife from the kitchen, was threatening self-harm, was saying things that terrified her. Police were on their way, but she wanted Noah to know because Riley kept saying his name. Noah didn't know what to say. He felt responsible even though rationally he knew he wasn't. He'd ended a relationship, which was his right. Riley's response wasn't his fault, but the guilt was there anyway, heavy and persistent. He stayed on the phone with Mrs. Knox until she said police had arrived, that Riley was being taken to the hospital for psychiatric evaluation, that he should try to go back to sleep though that seemed impossible. The incident resulted in a mandatory psychiatric hold for Riley, 72 hours of evaluation in a hospital facility. Mrs. Knox called Noah again the next day, apologizing for her child's behavior, trying to explain that Riley had struggled with mental health issues for years, that the relationship ending had triggered something profound. She asked if Noah would consider talking to Riley once released, thought maybe a conversation could provide closure that might help. Noah politely but firmly declined. He felt sympathy for Mrs. Knox, for anyone watching their child spiral, but he also knew that maintaining distance was essential for his own safety and well-being. When Riley was released from the hospital after 3 days, there was a brief period of hope that perhaps the intervention had helped, that medication and counseling were addressing the underlying issues. But within a week, the harassment resumed. Riley violated the restraining order by showing up at a restaurant where Noah was having dinner with friends. Riley sat at the bar, staring, making no attempt to hide the surveillance. Noah called police immediately. Officers arrived, arrested Riley for violating the order, and the legal process began in earnest. The trial, when it happened months later, was emotionally exhausting for Noah. He had to testify, to describe the relationship's progression from seemingly healthy to controlling to frightening. He had to share private text messages, read aloud Riley's threats, explain to a courtroom full of strangers how he'd felt trapped and terrified in what had started as a relationship he'd wanted. The defense tried to paint Noah as unreliable, suggested he'd encouraged Riley's attention until deciding it was inconvenient, implied the break-in might have been staged. But the evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, text records, police reports, the violation of a restraining order in front of witnesses. The first trial ended with a hung jury. One juror couldn't be convinced beyond reasonable doubt that Riley intended to harm Noah, interpreted the threats as expressions of emotional pain rather than genuine danger. Noah was devastated. The process had been traumatic, forcing him to relive months of fear and manipulation, and ending without resolution felt unbearable. He seriously considered giving up, moving away, starting over somewhere Riley couldn't find him. But the prosecutor urged him to proceed with a retrial, assured him that the evidence was strong, that justice would prevail. The second trial was quicker, more efficient. The prosecution had refined their strategy, focused on the pattern of escalation rather than individual incidents. They brought in an expert on domestic violence who explained how obsessive relationships develop, how threats should be interpreted, how victims often underestimate danger. Noah's testimony was stronger, more confident, less vulnerable to defense attacks. And this time, The jury deliberated for only 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all charges: stalking, harassment, property destruction, violation of a restraining order. Sentencing came weeks later. Riley's defense argued for leniency, pointed to mental health struggles, suggested intensive therapy rather than prison time. The prosecution argued for a sentence that reflected the severity of Riley's actions, the prolonged nature of the harassment, the clear danger posed to Noah. The judge split the difference somewhat, sentencing Riley to 6 years in prison with mandatory mental health treatment, to be followed by 10 years of probation with strict no-contact provisions. Noah attended the sentencing but didn't speak. He'd been given the opportunity to make an impact statement, to describe how Riley's actions had affected his life. But he'd decided against it, felt he'd said enough already, wanted to begin the process of moving forward rather than dwelling on the past. He sat in the courtroom, listened to the sentence pronounced, watched Riley being led away, and felt complicated relief. 6 years was both a long time and nothing compared to the impact on his life. But it was over, at least this chapter. In the aftermath, Noah struggled to rebuild normalcy. The trauma lingered in ways he hadn't anticipated. He startled easily at unexpected sounds. He scrutinized everyone he met for signs of instability. He kept his personal life private, reluctant to share on social media or be vulnerable in ways that could be exploited. Friends and family wanted him to date again, to not let one terrible experience define his future, but the thought of trusting someone with access to his life felt impossible. Therapy helped, slowly. He found a counselor who specialized in abuse survivors, who didn't push him toward recovery milestones before he was ready, who validated that what he'd experienced was serious trauma deserving of time and care to process. He learned language for things he'd intuited, that love and control are opposites, that intensity isn't the same as intimacy, that his instincts about the relationship being unhealthy had been correct even when he'd overridden them. Noah's story became something he rarely shared. When new people asked about his relationship history, he kept it vague, unwilling to launch into explanations that would dominate conversations and reshape how people saw him. He didn't want to be defined by what Riley had done, didn't want every interaction filtered through the lens of victimhood. He was trying to be a person who'd survived something difficult and moved forward, not a cautionary tale or an object of pity. Years later, approaching Riley's release date, Noah felt the anxiety return. 6 years had passed, time he'd spent rebuilding his design business, developing healthier friendships, eventually dating someone who respected boundaries and understood consent as an ongoing conversation rather than one-time agreement. He'd moved to a different city partly for work opportunities, but also to create distance from memories. He'd changed his name professionally, made his online presence harder to trace. He'd done everything possible to make himself difficult to find if Riley decided to resume contact. The probation terms were strict. No contact with Noah, no entering his city of residence, mandatory check-ins with a probation officer, continued mental health treatment. Violation would result in returning to prison to serve the remainder of the original sentence. These protections helped somewhat, but Noah knew paper restrictions only went so far. Riley had violated a restraining order before. What would stop it from happening again? He decided not to live in fear. He took reasonable precautions, kept his address unlisted, maintained security cameras, had friends and family who knew the situation and would notice if he suddenly went silent. But he refused to hide completely, to let Riley's past actions dictate his present choices. He'd survived something terrible and built a good life afterward. That was his victory, more meaningful than any sentence a court could impose. Ridgeview sprawled across the plains of Plains State, a city of modest size that served as a regional hub for surrounding agricultural communities. It had a downtown that tried hard to be charming, a state university campus on the eastern edge, and shopping districts that catered to both locals and students. The city felt transient in some ways, people coming for college and leaving after graduation, but there was a core of long-term residents who'd raised multiple generations there and considered it home. Hannah Brooks was 18 that spring, graduating from Ridgeview High School in a few weeks. She'd been accepted to the state university, planning to study nursing, and had already registered for fall classes. She was an only child, close with her parents Carol and David Brooks, the kind of family that had dinner together most nights and actually talked about their days. Her friends described her as responsible, the designated driver, the one who made sure everyone got home safely after parties. That Saturday in May, Hannah needed a new dress for graduation. Her mother had offered to go shopping with her, but Hannah insisted she could handle it alone, wanted to practice the independence she'd need when living in dorms. Carol agreed reluctantly, the way parents do when they know their child is ready but aren't quite ready themselves to accept it. They agreed Hannah would go to the shopping center across town, text when she arrived, and when she was leaving, be home by 4 for an early dinner with visiting relatives. Hannah left the house around 11, her car trunk already loaded with items she'd need for her dorm room in the fall. She'd been accumulating things for months, excited about the upcoming transition. Carol hugged her goodbye, reminded her to text, watched her drive away with that mixture of pride and melancholy parents feel when watching children take steps toward independence. The shopping center was busy that Saturday, lots of families out for weekend errands and meals. Hannah texted her mom at 11:30. "Got here fine, starting at Macy's." Carol responded with a thumbs up and heart emoji. It was the last communication Hannah would send. Security footage from the shopping center would later be analyzed frame by frame, creating a timeline of what should have been an unremarkable afternoon. The footage showed Hannah entering Macy's at 11:32. She browsed for about 40 minutes, tried on several dresses, purchased one at 12:15. She walked through the store carrying a shopping bag, checking her phone, heading toward the exit. Nothing about her body language suggested concern or awareness of danger. She left through the main entrance at 12:20, walked across the parking lot toward where her car was parked in an area that got full sun and was therefore less desirable, which meant fewer nearby vehicles. This was noted later, discussed as if choosing a less crowded section of parking lot represented some failure of judgment, though it was actually just pragmatic temperature management on a warm day. The critical footage came from a camera positioned to monitor the parking lot's perimeter. It showed Hannah approaching her car, keys already in hand. She was maybe 30 feet away when a man appeared in frame, walking from the opposite direction. Their paths would intersect near her car, which shouldn't have been notable. Parking lots are shared spaces. People walk past each other constantly. But something about his trajectory seemed purposeful, less random pedestrian and more targeted approach. Hannah reached her car. She pressed the key fob. The lights flashed indicating the doors unlocked. She reached for the driver's door handle. The man accelerated his approach, closed the distance in seconds. Hannah turned, seemed to realize something was wrong. Her mouth opened, likely to scream. The man grabbed her, one hand over her mouth, the other around her body, pulling her away from her car. She struggled, dropped her shopping bag and keys, tried to fight. But he was larger, stronger, and prepared while she was ambushed. The entire abduction took less than 20 seconds. He forced her toward a vehicle parked nearby, a dark van whose sliding door was already open. He pushed her inside, climbed in after her, and the van pulled away. The driver was visible only briefly, couldn't be clearly identified from the footage. The van's license plate was obscured, deliberately covered with something that made it unreadable to cameras. The whole operation had been planned, executed with disturbing efficiency. At 4 o'clock, when Hannah hadn't returned home, Carol called her cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She texted, "Where are you? Relatives are here." No response. By 4:30, Carol was calling David at work, telling him something was wrong. By 5, they were at the shopping center, driving through the parking lot, calling Hannah's name. They found her car still parked, doors locked, but keys on the ground nearby, her shopping bag sitting where it had fallen. David called 911 immediately. Police arrived quickly, took statements, reviewed the shopping center's security footage. Within an hour, they knew they were dealing with an abduction. Within 2 hours, every officer in Ridgeview was looking for the van. Within 3 hours, Hannah's photo was on every news channel in the state, described as critically missing, endangered. The investigation moved fast because everyone understood time was everything in abduction cases. The van was generic enough to be difficult to trace, but not so common that it didn't narrow the field. Police started checking registrations for similar vehicles in the region, prioritizing owners with criminal histories. They interviewed everyone who'd been in the shopping center that afternoon, trying to find someone who'd noticed the van or the men inside before the abduction occurred. They checked traffic cameras along every possible route from the shopping center, trying to track where the van had gone. Carol and David Brooks existed in a state of suspended horror. Their relatives, who'd come for a celebration, instead stayed to provide support during a nightmare. The house filled with people trying to help, bringing food no one could eat, making phone calls to mobilize community search efforts, sitting with Carol when she couldn't be alone with her thoughts. David paced constantly, unable to sit still, feeling he should be doing something but having no idea what. The first major break came from an unlikely source. A traffic camera 15 miles from the shopping center had captured the van running a red light about 30 minutes after the abduction. The image was clear enough to read the license plate, or rather to see that the obscuring material had fallen off, revealing actual numbers. Police ran the plate. It came back to a vehicle reported stolen 3 days earlier from a parking lot outside a grocery store. The theft had been filed but not investigated with any priority. Now, it became the key to everything. The stolen vehicle report included information about where it had last been seen legitimately. Police went to that location, canvassed the area, showed Hannah's photo to everyone they encountered. A gas station attendant recognized her picture, said he'd seen the van at his station the previous evening. The men had paid cash for fuel, had been in a hurry, and the attendant remembered thinking they seemed nervous about something, though he hadn't processed why at the time. The gas station's surveillance footage from the previous evening showed the van clearly. It also showed the two men inside, full facial shots as they came in to pay. Police immediately began circulating those images. Within hours, both men were identified through facial recognition in criminal databases. Marcus Doyle, 37, with a history of theft and assault. His companion, identified as Kevin Reed, 41, with a longer record including kidnapping in another state years earlier. Arrest warrants were issued immediately. Bolo alerts went statewide, then regional. Every law enforcement agency was looking for these two men in the van. Media coverage intensified, the photos of Marcus and Kevin appearing alongside Hannah's. The public urged to call immediately if they spotted either the men or the vehicle. Tips flooded in from people who thought they'd seen them. Most false alarms, but each one carefully checked. Meanwhile, Hannah had been missing for over 24 hours. Statistics on abduction survival rates are grim. The first 24 hours are critical, and after that, the likelihood of finding victims alive drops dramatically. Carol and David knew this, had been told repeatedly by well-meaning people trying to maintain hope while being realistic. They existed in agony, unable to eat or sleep, haunted by thoughts of what Hannah might be experiencing, desperate for any news even if it was bad. The breakthrough came on Sunday afternoon. A patrol officer in a rural area 60 miles from Ridgeview noticed a van matching the description parked behind an abandoned farm building. He called for backup rather than approaching alone, knowing these suspects were dangerous. Within 20 minutes, the area was surrounded by local police and state troopers. The van was empty but clearly had been occupied recently, fast food wrappers and other evidence of recent use still inside. The search expanded to the building and surrounding property. Officers found signs of recent habitation in the farmhouse. Someone had been staying there despite the property being officially abandoned. And in a storm cellar beneath the house, they found Hannah. She was alive, bound and injured, but alive. The terror in her eyes when officers first opened the cellar door would haunt the responding officers for years. But she was alive. EMTs were called immediately. Hannah was transported to the hospital, Carol and David meeting her there, crying as they saw their daughter being wheeled into the emergency room. She'd been assaulted, would need surgery and extensive recovery, both physical and psychological. But she would survive. It was more than many families in similar situations got. The manhunt for Marcus Doyle and Kevin Reed continued with renewed intensity. They'd apparently fled when they realized police were searching the area, abandoning Hannah rather than being caught with her. That decision saved her life, but it meant two dangerous men were still at large. Marcus was caught first, less than 12 hours after Hannah's rescue. He was spotted at a truck stop trying to hitch a ride, looking exhausted and desperate. State troopers arrested him without incident, though he initially tried to claim mistaken identity before the evidence became overwhelming. He had Hannah's credit card in his wallet, her phone in his jacket pocket, and scratches on his face that clearly came from someone fighting back. Kevin Reed took longer to find. He'd gone into the woods, apparently hoping to wait out the immediate search and then escape the region. But the area was sealed off. 9 units were deployed, and helicopters with thermal imaging scanned the terrain. After 3 days of evading capture, cold and hungry, Kevin walked out to a rural road and surrendered to a shocked farmer who immediately called police. Both men were charged with kidnapping, assault, and a series of related crimes. The evidence was overwhelming, from the surveillance footage showing the abduction to Hannah's identification of her attackers to the physical evidence connecting them to the crime. But there were complications. Marcus and Kevin each tried to blame the other for planning the abduction to minimize their own roles. Their attorneys would argue about degrees of responsibility, about who initiated what, and who could have stopped things before they escalated. The Brooks family focused on Hannah's recovery. She spent a week in the hospital, underwent surgery to repair injuries, began the long process of healing. Physically, doctors were optimistic. Emotionally and psychologically, the road would be much longer. She'd lived through every parent's nightmare, had been held captive for over 30 hours, had faced the absolute worst of human behavior. The trauma was profound and would require years of therapy to process. Hannah struggled to talk about what happened. Some memories were clear, sharp-edged, and intrusive. Others were fragmented, her mind mercifully obscuring certain details. She remembered the parking lot, the sudden attack, the van's interior smelling of cigarettes and mildew. She remembered being terrified, being certain she would die. She remembered the storm cellar's darkness, the sounds above her suggesting her captors were arguing about what to do with her. And she remembered the moment the cellar door opened and she saw police uniforms, the flood of relief so intense she couldn't speak. The trial, when it finally happened nearly 2 years later, forced Hannah to relive everything publicly. She had to testify, to describe the abduction and captivity in clinical detail while her attackers sat across the courtroom. She had to be cross-examined by defense attorneys trying to find inconsistencies in her account. She had to remain composed while evidence was presented, photos shown, her own words read back. It was re-traumatizing in ways everyone had warned her about, but that still hit harder than she'd anticipated. Marcus's defense tried to argue he'd been coerced by Kevin, that he was a victim too in some sense, that his participation was reluctant. The evidence contradicted this narrative. Surveillance footage showed Marcus was the one who grabbed Hannah in the parking lot. His fingerprints were throughout the storm cellar. His DNA was recovered from Hannah's clothing. He'd been an active, willing participant in every aspect of the crime. Kevin's defense took a different approach, suggesting diminished capacity due to drug addiction and mental health issues. They presented evidence of his traumatic childhood, his struggles with substance abuse, his previous mental health diagnoses. The intent seemed to be humanizing him, making him someone who'd made terrible choices but deserved mercy. The prosecution countered that whatever his personal struggles, he'd planned and executed a kidnapping, had terrorized a young woman, and needed to face full accountability for those choices. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for both men. Marcus showed no reaction to the verdict. Kevin broke down, crying in a way that might have been genuine remorse, but felt manipulative to those who'd watched him throughout the trial. Hannah sat between her parents, gripping their hands, crying quietly with relief that this chapter was ending. Sentencing brought victim impact statements. Carol spoke about watching her daughter leave that Saturday morning, about the last hug, about how she'd never take a moment with Hannah for granted again. David spoke about the hours of not knowing, about the terror of imagining worst-case scenarios, about how the justice system couldn't undo what had happened, but could at least ensure these men never got the opportunity to hurt anyone else. And Hannah, finding strength she didn't know she had, spoke directly to Marcus and Kevin. She didn't forgive them. She said they'd tried to destroy her but had failed, that she was still here, still planning her future, still going to nursing school, still becoming the person she was meant to be despite their efforts to end her life. The judge sentenced Marcus to 40 years in prison without possibility of parole for 30. Kevin received 35 years with possibility of parole after 25. Both sentences reflected the severity of their crimes, the planning involved, the violence inflicted, and the trauma caused. Neither man would be young when released, if they lived long enough to see parole eligibility. Hannah's childhood would be behind her, possibly her entire young adulthood, before they had any chance of freedom. But the story didn't end with sentencing. Carol and David Brooks, channeling their trauma into action, became advocates for changing laws around emergency data access. They'd learned during the investigation that police had needed warrants to access Hannah's phone location data quickly, that even in a clear abduction case, there were privacy protections that delayed potentially life-saving information. They understood the reasoning, the importance of civil liberties, but they also believed exceptions should exist for true emergencies. They worked with state legislators to draft what became known as Hannah's Law, legislation that allowed law enforcement to access location data from tech companies without a warrant in cases of clear imminent danger to life. The law included strict criteria to prevent abuse, verification from supervisory officers, immediate post-access auditing, penalties for misuse. It balanced privacy protections with emergency response needs. The bill faced opposition from privacy advocates who worried about government overreach, about what constituted clear imminent danger, about the potential for the law to be expanded beyond its original intent. The Brooks family understood these concerns, engaged in good faith with critics, worked to strengthen the bill's protections against abuse. The resulting law wasn't perfect, but it was carefully constructed to serve a specific purpose. Hannah's Law was signed into law on the second anniversary of her abduction. Hannah attended the signing ceremony, standing beside the governor as he added his signature to legislation bearing her name. She looked different than she had 2 years earlier, older in ways that transcended mere chronology. She'd lost something in that storm cellar, an innocence about how the world worked, a baseline assumption of safety. But she'd gained something too, a determination to ensure her experience served some larger purpose, that other families might be spared similar agony. The law's impact was measurable. In the first year after implementation, location data accessed under Hannah's Law provisions helped locate 4 abducted individuals, 3 of them children. The emergency data access shaved hours off response times, hours that proved critical to survival. Law enforcement praised the legislation. Privacy advocates monitored its use carefully, ensuring that the feared abuses didn't materialize. And the Brooks family felt some measure of meaning emerging from their nightmare. Not compensation or healing exactly, but purpose. Hannah did go to nursing school eventually, delayed by a year while she recovered and dealt with the trial. She graduated with honors, found work in an emergency department, drawn to helping people in their worst moments. Her coworkers didn't know her story initially. She didn't advertise it, didn't want special treatment or to be defined by trauma. But eventually the story came out, as these things do, and she found that her experience informed her nursing practice in valuable ways. She understood fear, could recognize trauma responses, knew how to be present with people in crisis without platitudes or empty reassurance. She also became a quiet advocate for victims' rights, speaking occasionally at law enforcement trainings about the investigation from a victim's perspective, about what helped and what didn't, about the importance of believing victims and moving quickly in time-sensitive cases. She didn't make it her full-time work, didn't want to become a professional survivor, but she offered insights when asked, contributed to a conversation she hadn't chosen to be part of but could at least influence. Years later, a reporter asked Hannah if she'd forgiven Marcus and Kevin. She thought about it, really considered the question rather than giving an automatic answer. Then she said, "Forgiveness is complicated. I don't think about them much anymore, which feels like its own kind of freedom. They don't occupy space in my head the way they did initially. But forgiveness? That's not my responsibility. They made their choices. They're serving their sentences. I'm living my life. That's not forgiveness exactly. It's just moving forward." The reporter asked if she was glad Hannah's Law existed, if seeing its positive impact helped with her recovery. Hannah smiled, a complicated expression that suggested she'd thought about this often. "The law is good. It saved lives. I'm proud my parents fought for it. But it doesn't undo what happened to me. It doesn't make the night terrors stop or the hypervigilance disappear. It's meaningful in a big-picture way, but it doesn't heal me personally. Recovery is individual work, not legislative accomplishment. I think that's important to understand. We can change systems and still be dealing with personal trauma. Both things are true." The conversation shifted to how she thought about safety now, whether she felt paranoid or if she'd managed to reclaim some sense of security. Hannah was honest. She said parking lots still triggered anxiety, that she parked near entrances now even in hot weather, that she was hyper-aware of her surroundings in ways she hadn't been before. But she also said she refused to live in fear, refused to let Marcus and Kevin's actions dictate her choices indefinitely. She went shopping alone. She lived independently. She dated, eventually, though that required vulnerability that felt terrifying initially. They tried to end my story that day in the parking lot, Hannah said. But they didn't succeed. I'm still here, still writing the rest of it. That has to count for something. North Briar was a small city in Stonehaven State, the kind of place where everybody seemed connected by a few degrees of separation at most. The downtown had been revitalized in recent years with the coffee shops and boutiques and restaurants that characterized modest urban renewal. The city had a community college, several large employers in light manufacturing, and residential neighborhoods where people still knew their neighbors and watched out for each other's kids. Claire Whitlock was 20 that fall, working as a server at a restaurant downtown while taking classes at the community college. She was studying psychology, interested in mental health work, drawn to understanding how people's minds worked and how to help those struggling. She lived in a small apartment with a roommate, was close with her younger sister Emma, and talked to her parents regularly even though they lived 2 hours away in another part of the state. Claire had been dating Evan Pierce for about 8 months. They'd met at a party, started talking, discovered they shared interests in music and hiking. Evan was 23, worked in construction, and had been open from early in their relationship about his struggles with depression and anxiety. He'd been hospitalized twice in the past for mental health crises, took medication that he said helped most of the time, and saw a therapist semi-regularly. Claire appreciated his honesty about his challenges, saw it as evidence of self-awareness and commitment to managing his health. But recently, things had been deteriorating. Evan had lost his job after missing too many shifts. He'd stopped going to therapy, claiming it wasn't helping and he couldn't afford the copays. He'd become less consistent with his medication, sometimes taking it and sometimes forgetting in ways that seemed more intentional than accidental. His mood swings had intensified, periods of relative stability interrupted by days of severe depression or bursts of anger that seemed disproportionate to whatever triggered them. Claire tried to be supportive. She understood mental illness wasn't a choice, that Evan was struggling with brain chemistry he couldn't fully control. She encouraged him to stay on his medication, offered to help him find affordable therapy options, tried to be patient when he was having difficult days. But increasingly, she felt like she was drowning too, like his mental health was consuming all her energy and leaving none for her own well-being or her studies or her other relationships. Her roommate, Jessica, had started expressing concern. She'd witnessed Evan's mood swings, had heard him yelling at Claire during arguments that seemed to come from nowhere. She'd seen Claire making excuses for missed study sessions, for skipped hangouts with friends, for the exhaustion that seemed to be her constant state. Jessica urged Claire to consider whether the relationship was sustainable, whether loving someone meant sacrificing yourself to their needs indefinitely. But #Batch 11 continued, completing 2,000 words. Claire felt guilty at the thought of leaving someone when they were struggling, felt like abandoning Evan during his mental health crisis would make her a terrible person. In late October, Evan's behavior escalated dramatically. He'd been trying to get readmitted to a psychiatric facility, recognizing he was spiraling, but beds were limited and the waiting list was long. Unless someone posed an immediate danger to themselves or others, they were told to wait, to try outpatient resources, to call crisis lines if things got worse. Evan had called the crisis line multiple times. He'd gone to the emergency room twice, been evaluated, and sent home with recommendations to follow up with outpatient care that had months-long waiting lists. Claire watched this happening, felt the system failing someone who was actively seeking help, who knew he needed intervention but couldn't access it quickly enough. She tried to fill the gaps, checking on him constantly, letting him stay at her apartment when he didn't feel safe alone, talking him through dark moments when he called at 3 in the morning. Her grades suffered. Her work performance declined. Her own mental health deteriorated under the weight of responsibility she'd taken on. One evening, after a particularly difficult day where Evan had talked about not wanting to live anymore, Claire suggested maybe it was time to go to the emergency room again, to tell them explicitly that he was having suicidal thoughts and needed admission. Evan exploded. He accused her of trying to get rid of him, of not really caring, of treating him like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. The argument escalated quickly, his voice getting louder, his anger becoming frightening in its intensity. Jessica was home, heard the shouting through Claire's bedroom door. She knocked, asked if everything was okay. Evan told her to mind her own business in language that was threatening enough that Jessica called their apartment building security. By the time security arrived, Evan had stormed out, slamming the door hard enough to crack the frame. Claire sat on her bed crying, apologizing to Jessica, promising this wasn't normal, that Evan was just having a really hard time. Jessica sat beside her and said something Claire needed to hear. You can't love someone into mental health. You can support someone who's doing the work of managing their illness, but you can't fix him. And it's not okay that he's taking his struggles out on you. Mental illness explains behavior, but it doesn't excuse it. You deserve to be safe, even if he's struggling. The words hit Claire hard because they articulated something she'd been feeling but couldn't quite voice. She loved Evan, wanted to help him, but she was also becoming afraid of him in moments when his anger spiked unpredictably. That fear felt like a betrayal of someone who was suffering, but it was also valid, a response to real behavior that was escalating. The next morning, Evan called to apologize. He was calmer, sounded genuinely remorseful about the previous night. He promised to get back on his medication consistently, to make therapy a priority, to work harder at managing his responses. Claire wanted to believe him. She accepted the apology, agreed to see him that evening to talk things through properly. But Evan didn't show up for their planned conversation. He didn't answer his phone. Claire tried texting, calling, even drove by his apartment, but there was no response. By midnight, she was worried enough to call his mother, Mrs. Pierce, who lived across town. Mrs. Pierce hadn't heard from Evan either, but promised to check on him first thing in the morning. At 6 a.m., Mrs. Pierce called Claire back, her voice tight with controlled panic. She'd gone to Evan's apartment and found the door unlocked. Evan wasn't there, but the apartment was disturbing. Furniture overturned, holes punched in walls, and written on the bathroom mirror in what looked like permanent marker, "I'm sorry. This is the only way." Mrs. Pierce had called the police. They were treating it as a potential suicide risk, putting out alerts to area hospitals and checking locations where Evan was known to frequent. Claire felt sick with guilt and fear. If something happened to Evan, would it be her fault for suggesting psychiatric admission? For not being patient enough? For considering ending the relationship? The call came mid-morning. Evan had been spotted at a convenience store buying beer and cigarettes. Police approached him for a welfare check, and he'd cooperated initially, seemed lucid and calm. But when they tried to take him for psychiatric evaluation based on what Mrs. Pierce had reported, he'd become combative, resisted, and had to be physically restrained. He was now being held for evaluation, would be admitted to the state psychiatric hospital for at least 72 hours. Claire felt relieved and guilty about feeling relieved. Evan was safe, was getting help, but under circumstances that were traumatic and involuntary. She visited him at the hospital later that week, after he'd been stabilized on medication and was accepting visitors. He seemed better, apologized for scaring everyone, talked about finally getting the intensive help he needed. But he also said something that chilled Claire. "When I get out of here, we need to talk about our future. About you supporting me the way I need, not trying to control me by threatening hospitalization." The comment felt wrong, a distortion of what had actually happened, but Claire didn't correct him. She just nodded, promised they'd talk, and left feeling more confused than ever about what she owed him and what she owed herself. Evan was released from the hospital after 10 days. He'd been stabilized, had a new medication regimen, had appointments scheduled with an outpatient therapist and psychiatrist. He seemed better initially, more like the person Claire had met months earlier. But within 2 weeks, old patterns reasserted themselves. He stopped taking one of his medications because it made him feel foggy. He missed his therapy appointments, claiming the therapist didn't understand him. He started calling Claire multiple times a day, needing reassurance, needing her presence, needing her to solve problems he was perfectly capable of handling himself. Claire's family had been watching this unfold from a distance, getting filtered information from Claire, who minimized the difficulties to avoid their concern. But her sister Emma visited one weekend and saw the situation clearly. She saw Claire's exhaustion, the way she jumped every time her phone rang, the anxiety that had become her baseline. Emma talked to their parents, who called Claire for a serious conversation. They didn't issue ultimatums or demand she end the relationship. They just asked questions. Was she happy? Did she feel safe? Was this relationship adding to her life or consuming it? When was the last time she'd done something just for herself? and they reminded her that she wasn't responsible for Evan's mental health, that supporting someone didn't mean sacrificing her own well-being. Claire promised to think about it, to consider what she wanted independent of what Evan needed. But before she could reach any conclusions, the situation escalated in ways no one predicted. It happened on a Tuesday evening in December. Claire had just gotten home from work, was making dinner when Evan showed up at her apartment unannounced. He seemed agitated, talked rapidly about feeling like he was losing everything, like his life was falling apart. Claire tried to calm him down, offered food, suggested watching a movie together. But Evan wasn't interested in being calmed. He wanted something from Claire, some declaration of permanent commitment, some promise that she'd never leave no matter what. Claire, exhausted and reaching her breaking point, couldn't make that promise. She tried to be honest, said she loved him but was struggling, that she needed him to take responsibility for his own health, that their relationship couldn't continue the way it had been. Evan's reaction was immediate and terrifying. He grabbed Claire, pinned her against the wall, his hands around her throat, screaming that she was just like everyone else, that she'd promised to support him and now was abandoning him when he needed her most. Jessica heard the commotion from her bedroom, ran out to find Evan choking Claire. She screamed at him to stop, grabbed a lamp, and threatened to hit him with it. The disruption broke Evan's grip on Claire, who fell to the floor gasping. Evan seemed to come back to himself, looked horrified at what he'd done, and ran from the apartment. Jessica immediately called 911. Police and paramedics arrived within minutes. Claire had visible bruises on her neck, was shaking uncontrollably, kept saying it was her fault, that she'd upset him, that he didn't mean it. The responding officer, experienced with domestic violence calls, recognized the self-blame pattern immediately. She carefully explained to Claire that mental illness didn't excuse assault, that Evan had made a choice to hurt her, that this wasn't her responsibility. Claire was taken to the hospital for evaluation. The injuries weren't severe physically, but the psychological impact was significant. She'd been attacked by someone she loved, someone she'd been trying to help. The betrayal of that, the confusion of loving someone and also being terrified of them, was overwhelming. Police put out a warrant for Evan's arrest on assault charges. He turned himself in the next morning, accompanied by his mother. He was charged, posted bail, and released with a no-contact order prohibiting him from approaching Claire. The legal process began, though it would take months to work through the system. But Evan didn't leave it there. Despite the no-contact order, he called Claire repeatedly from different numbers, left voicemails apologizing and begging for another chance. He showed up at her workplace, causing her manager to call police and escort him from the premises. And then, on a Friday evening 3 weeks after the assault, he appeared at her parents' house 2 hours away, apparently having driven there looking for Claire, who'd gone home to stay with family while things settled. Claire's father, Robert, answered the door to find Evan standing on the porch, looking disheveled and manic. Before Robert could speak, Evan pushed past him into the house, calling for Claire. Robert's wife Margaret called 911 immediately, while Robert tried to physically block Evan from going further into the house. The situation escalated quickly. Evan, larger and younger than Robert, shoved him aside. Robert fell, hitting his head on a side table, blood immediately visible. Claire heard the commotion from upstairs and made the split-second decision to barricade herself in a bathroom rather than come down. Emma, also in the house, ran to help their father while Margaret stayed on the line with 911, giving updates as the dispatcher coordinated police response. Evan seemed to realize what he'd done to Robert, seemed to come back to awareness, and ran from the house before police arrived. Robert was taken to the hospital with a concussion. The physical injuries weren't life-threatening, but the violence had escalated dramatically. Evan had now assaulted Claire, violated a protection order, broken into her parents' home, and attacked her father. The charges mounted: assault, stalking, home invasion, violation of a court order. He was now considered dangerous, possibly in a mental health crisis, and a statewide alert was issued. Evan was found the next day, incoherent and disoriented, walking along a highway shoulder. He was taken into custody without resistance, seemed barely aware of what was happening. A psychiatric evaluation determined he was not competent to stand trial in his current state, was experiencing a severe mental health episode. He was committed to a secure psychiatric facility for treatment and evaluation. The legal process became complicated. Evan's attorneys argued their client hadn't been in control of his actions, that mental illness had rendered him unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct, that he needed treatment, not punishment. The prosecution countered that Evan had made choices along the way, had stopped taking medication, had ignored warnings, had been offered help and refused it. They argued he was dangerous regardless of the underlying mental health issues, that public safety required consequences. Claire found herself caught in an impossible position. She felt sympathy for Evan, understood he was genuinely ill, didn't want to be vindictive. But she also carried bruises on her neck, had nightmares about hands squeezing, couldn't go back to her own apartment without panic attacks. Her father had been injured protecting her. Her family's sense of safety in their own home had been shattered. Mental illness explained what happened, but it didn't undo the trauma. The trial was delayed repeatedly as Evan underwent treatment and competency evaluations. It took 9 months before he was deemed restored to competency, able to understand the charges against him and assist in his defense. By that time, Claire had moved to a different city, changed jobs, was trying to rebuild a life that felt safe. The thought of returning for trial testimony filled her with dread. When the trial finally began, Claire had to face Evan across a courtroom. He looked different, medicated and stable, more like the person she'd initially met than the terrifying figure who'd attacked her. His attorneys presented a defense focused on mental health, on the failure of the system to provide adequate care, on Evan's attempts to get help that were rebuffed or delayed. They brought in expert witnesses to explain his diagnoses, his treatment history, his cognitive state during the assaults. The prosecution didn't dispute that Evan had mental health issues. They disputed that those issues removed his responsibility for his actions. They showed evidence of planning, of conscious choices made even while struggling. They demonstrated that Evan had moments of lucidity, had known what he was doing was wrong, had violated the protection order deliberately. And they focused on impact, on the trauma inflicted on multiple victims, on the danger Evan posed to others. Claire's testimony was the most difficult thing she'd ever done. She had to describe the assault in detail, had to relive the moment of being choked, had to explain the fear that still dominated her life. She had to be cross-examined by defense attorneys who suggested, gently but clearly, that she'd contributed to Evan's deterioration by threatening to leave him during a crisis. She had to maintain composure while Evan cried at the defense table, looking genuinely remorseful but also helpless, a person destroyed by his own brain chemistry. Her father testified about the home invasion, about trying to protect his family, about the head injury that still caused occasional migraines months later. Margaret testified about the terror of hearing violence in her home, of not knowing if her husband or daughters would be hurt, of the lasting anxiety that made her check locks obsessively and startle at unexpected sounds. Emma testified about helping her injured father while Evan was somewhere in the house, about the impossibility of feeling safe anywhere after that night. The jury deliberated for 2 days. They returned a verdict that split the difference between the prosecution's demands and the defense's arguments. Guilty on all charges, but with recognition of mental health as a significant factor. The judge ordered a comprehensive sentencing evaluation, including extensive psychiatric assessment. At sentencing, both sides presented their cases for what justice should look like. The prosecution argued for significant prison time, followed by supervised release with strict conditions. The defense argued for commitment to a psychiatric facility for treatment, with criminal consequences only if Evan failed to engage with treatment successfully. The judge listened to impact statements from Claire and her family, to Evan's own statement accepting responsibility and promising to commit to treatment, and to expert testimony about the likelihood of rehabilitation versus recidivism. The sentence reflected the complexity: 12 years in prison with credit for time served, but with a significant portion potentially suspended if Evan successfully completed intensive mental health treatment programs available through the corrections system. He would be required to take medication as prescribed, attend therapy regularly, and have no disciplinary violations related to violence. After release, he would face 10 years of supervised probation with strict mental health treatment requirements and no contact provisions protecting Claire and her family. It was a sentence that satisfied no one completely. The prosecution felt it was too lenient given the violence. The defense felt it was too harsh given the mental health factors. Claire didn't know what she felt, just exhausted and ready for this chapter to close. 12 years meant she'd be in her 30s before Evan could possibly be released, that her entire 20s would pass with him incarcerated. It felt like both too long and not long enough simultaneously. The case became a flashpoint in discussions about mental health, criminal justice, and the gaps in care systems. Evan had tried to access help repeatedly and been told to wait, to manage with insufficient resources, to call crisis lines that provided short-term de-escalation but no long-term solutions. The system had failed him in real ways. But it had also failed Claire, who tried to support someone beyond her capacity to help and had been harmed as a result. And it had failed to protect the public from someone whose deteriorating mental state was documented but not addressed until after violence occurred. Advocates on multiple sides used the case to push their agendas. Mental health reform advocates pointed to the inadequate access to treatment that preceded the violence. Victims' rights advocates pointed to the danger of prioritizing an offender's mental health struggles over victim safety. Criminal justice reformers pointed to the need for better alternatives to incarceration for those with serious mental illness. Law and order advocates pointed to the necessity of removing dangerous individuals from society regardless of underlying causes. Claire stayed out of these debates as much as possible. She didn't want to be a symbol for any particular position. She just wanted to heal, to rebuild, to find some version of herself that existed independent of trauma and fear. Therapy helped, slowly, understanding that she'd done nothing wrong, that supporting someone and setting boundaries weren't contradictory, that she deserved safety even when someone else was suffering. These lessons took time to internalize. Her family healed too, though differently. Robert's physical injuries resolved, but he remained more cautious, more alert to potential danger in ways he hadn't been before. Margaret developed anxiety that required treatment, struggled with intrusive thoughts about what could have happened. Emma, youngest and most removed from the direct violence, carried guilt about not doing more to convince Claire to leave earlier, though rationally she knew that wouldn't have been possible or effective. Years later, a social worker doing research on domestic violence in relationships affected by mental illness interviewed Claire. The conversation was difficult but valuable. Claire talked honestly about the complexity of loving someone who's ill, about where support becomes enabling, about how mental health crises don't excuse abuse even when they explain it. She talked about the need for better intervention systems, for ways to help people before they reach crisis, for resources that don't require someone to be imminently dangerous before they qualify for intensive care. When asked what she'd want others in similar situations to know, Claire thought carefully. Mental illness is real and devastating and deserving of compassion. But your safety matters too. You can't heal someone else at the cost of destroying yourself. And the system's failures aren't yours to fix by accepting harm. It's possible to recognize that someone is suffering and also recognize that you need to protect yourself from them. Both things are true. It took me too long to understand that. The interviewer asked if Claire had any contact with Evan now, any sense of what his life looked like in prison. Claire shook her head. I don't want to know. That probably sounds cold. But I spent months of my life consumed by his well-being, sacrificing my own mental health trying to support his. I can hope he's getting treatment, hope he's better, without making it my responsibility to know. I released that obligation. I had to, for my own survival. When asked about forgiveness, Claire's response was immediate and firm. I'm not interested in forgiveness as some kind of gift to him or closure for me. I'm interested in building a life where what happened doesn't define every choice I make. That's not forgiveness. That's just moving forward. Maybe someday I'll feel differently, but right now, I'm okay with where I am. The interview concluded with Claire reflecting on what she wished had been different. Better mental health resources, obviously. Faster access to care, more intensive support for people in crisis. But also better education about what support looks like versus what codependency looks like. About recognizing when you're drowning, trying to save someone else. I thought love meant never giving up on someone. I learned it can also mean recognizing when you don't have the tools to help them and stepping back for everyone's safety. That's a hard lesson. I wish I'd learned it sooner, before anyone got hurt. The sun rose on another day as these stories settled into the past. No longer immediate crises, but permanent scars on multiple families. Lena and Maya were gone, their potential unrealized, their families left to imagine futures that would never exist. Eliza's son Mason was growing up without his mother, asking questions that had no good answers. Noah was rebuilding trust slowly, learning to recognize healthy relationships from harmful ones. Hannah carried her trauma while also carrying the knowledge that her experience had changed laws and saved lives. Claire was learning to live without constant fear, to believe in her right to safety, to see her survival as strength rather than failure. If you're still listening, still here in the quiet hours as these stories conclude, maybe you're thinking about the people in your own life, the relationships you're navigating, the red flags you've been ignoring, or the boundaries you've been afraid to set. Maybe you're thinking about systems that could work better, protections that should exist, warnings that should be heeded. Or maybe you're just tired, ready for sleep, having accompanied these victims and survivors through their worst moments and their long, difficult aftermaths. These stories don't have neat resolutions because life doesn't work that way. Justice systems process cases and move on to the next tragedy. Families carry their grief forever, learning to function around the holes left by violence. Survivors rebuild in ways that look different for each person, finding meaning or peace or simply persistence, whatever gets them through. If these stories resonated with you, if you saw yourself or someone you love in the warning signs, the patterns, the moments where intervention could have changed everything, please don't ignore that recognition. Share this video, leave a comment about where you're watching from, subscribe to stay connected to these important conversations. Not for the algorithm, but because these stories matter, because the victims deserve to be remembered, because the lessons shouldn't be learned repeatedly at the cost of more lives. The darkness holds many stories. Tonight, you've heard 5. Remember them, learn from them, and if you can, work to ensure fewer families have to live through chapters like these in the future. Rest now. Tomorrow brings its own challenges. But tonight, let these voices remind you that vigilance matters, that boundaries matter, that your safety matters. Sleep well.